Hey there, welcome to Rose. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The Book of Shadows. Have you ever stumbled upon something that felt out of place, something that seemed to call out to you with an inexplicable allure? I did, one rainy afternoon, when the world outside was drowned in a gray fog that seemed to seep into every crevice of my mind. It was in the dusty attic of my grandparents' old house, a place I had visited countless times as a child but never truly explored. The attic, with its slanted roof and creaky floorboards, had always felt like a forgotten realm, an archive of memories from a bygone era. This time, however, there was something different. I had returned to the house after my grandmother's passing, a solemn trip meant to sort through her belongings and prepare the house for sale. It was amidst this process of clearing and cataloging that I came across it, a large, leather-bound book nestled behind a stack of old newspapers. The book was unusually heavy and adorned with intricate, embossed patterns that seemed almost to shimmer in the dim light of the attic. Curiosity got the better of me. I dusted off the book and opened it, the pages crackling in protest. The initial pages were filled with dense, archaic text that was nearly impossible to decipher. But then, as I flipped through, the script began to shift, revealing detailed illustrations of bizarre symbols and rituals. It was the kind of thing you might expect to find in a dusty old tome of forgotten lore. Among these pages, one illustration stood out, a drawing of a figure cloaked in shadows, standing before a large, open book. The figure's face was obscured, but its posture exuded a sense of ominous authority. Below it was a text that read, "The path to the beyond is paved with knowledge unclaimed." I shut the book quickly, feeling an unsettling chill. The attic, which had seemed so benign moments before, now felt suffused with an eerie energy. I shook off the sensation and set the book aside, thinking perhaps I had just imagined the chill in the air. I continued my work, but the book remained in the back of my mind, a persistent whisper that I could not ignore. Days passed, and the book remained untouched. Each time I approached it, a sense of foreboding kept me at bay. It was as though the book itself was a sentinel guarding secrets that should not be unearthed. My nights were restless, plagued by dreams of shadowy figures and cryptic symbols. The mundane tasks of sorting through my grandmother's possessions became an afterthought as my thoughts fixated on the book. One evening, as I was preparing to leave for the day, I noticed a strange phenomenon. The attic light flickered sporadically, casting erratic shadows on the walls. I told myself it was just a faulty bulb, but the shadows seemed to dance and writhe in a way that defied logic. The book lay open on a dusty crate, and I could not help but notice that the pages had shifted. The illustrations had changed subtly, with the figure in the cloak now appearing to reach out towards me. Unable to ignore the growing sense of dread, I decided to consult the book again. As I turned the pages, the cryptic text seemed to form coherent phrases, almost as if it were communicating directly with me. My heart raced as I read the lines aloud, feeling a strange compulsion to continue. The gateway lies within the seeker. To invoke the unseen, one must understand the void. The words seemed to echo in the empty attic, their meaning both alluring and terrifying. I could feel a cold sweat forming on my brow as I struggled to make sense of the passage. It was as though the book was pulling me into its narrative, compelling me to unravel its mysteries. I closed the book with trembling hands, the creaking of the floorboards beneath me suddenly louder in the stillness. The shadows in the attic seemed to deepen, and I could no longer shake the feeling that I was not alone. The sense of being watched grew more intense, a palpable presence that seemed to close in around me. I left the attic that night with the book still on my mind, the unsettling feeling lingering long after I had closed the door behind me. Sleep eluded me as I lay in bed, my mind racing with thoughts of the book and its cryptic messages. It was clear that the discovery of the book was only the beginning of something far more unsettling. When morning came, I had hoped that sleep would have provided some clarity, but instead, I awoke with a profound sense of unease. The attic, with its dusty old treasures, had become a realm of dread. I told myself it was merely my imagination running wild, influenced by the mysterious nature of the book. Nevertheless, I felt compelled to return. As I ascended the stairs to the attic, the light filtering through the small windows seemed dimmer, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move on their own. My steps echoed unerringly loud in the silence, amplifying the tension in the air. The book lay exactly where I had left it, as if it had been waiting for me. I reached for it with a mixture of reluctance and curiosity, feeling its cold, leather cover against my fingertips. Opening it, I discovered that the pages had again shifted. The text and illustrations now appeared more detailed, almost as if the book were evolving. The symbols had become more complex, and some of the pages were filled with diagrams of rituals and incantations. Each page seemed to whisper secrets meant to be uncovered. The Book of Shadows. Have you ever stumbled upon something that felt out of place, something that seemed to call out to you with an inexplicable allure? I did, one rainy afternoon, when the world outside was drowned in a gray fog that seemed to seep into every crevice of my mind. It was in the dusty attic of my grandparents' old house, a place I had visited countless times as a child but never truly explored. The attic, with its slanted roof and creaky floorboards, had always felt like a forgotten realm, an archive of memories from a bygone era. This time, however, there was something different. I had returned to the house after my grandmother's passing, a solemn trip meant to sort through her belongings and prepare the house for sale. It was amidst this process of clearing and cataloging that I came across it, a large, leather-bound book nestled behind a stack of old newspapers. The book was unusually heavy and adorned with intricate, embossed patterns that seemed almost to shimmer in the dim light of the attic. Curiosity got the better of me. I dusted off the book and opened it, the pages crackling in protest. The initial pages were filled with dense, archaic text that was nearly impossible to decipher. But then, as I flipped through, the script began to shift, revealing detailed illustrations of bizarre symbols and rituals. It was the kind of thing you might expect to find in a dusty old tome of forgotten lore. Among these pages, one illustration stood out, a drawing of a figure cloaked in shadows, standing before a large, open book. The figure's face was obscured, but its posture exuded a sense of ominous authority. Below it was a text that read, "The path to the beyond is paved with knowledge unclaimed." I shut the book quickly, feeling an unsettling chill. The attic, which had seemed so benign moments before, now felt suffused with an eerie energy. I shook off the sensation and set the book aside, thinking perhaps I had just imagined the chill in the air. I continued my work, but the book remained in the back of my mind, a persistent whisper that I could not ignore. Days passed, and the book remained untouched. Each time I approached it, a sense of foreboding kept me at bay. It was as though the book itself was a sentinel guarding secrets that should not be unearthed. My nights were restless, plagued by dreams of shadowy figures and cryptic symbols. The mundane tasks of sorting through my grandmother's possessions became an afterthought as my thoughts fixated on the book. One evening, as I was preparing to leave for the day, I noticed a strange phenomenon. The attic light flickered sporadically, casting erratic shadows on the walls. I told myself it was just a faulty bulb, but the shadows seemed to dance and writhe in a way that defied logic. The book lay open on a dusty crate, and I could not help but notice that the pages had shifted. The illustrations had changed subtly, with the figure in the cloak now appearing to reach out towards me. Unable to ignore the growing sense of dread, I decided to consult the book again. As I turned the pages, the cryptic text seemed to form coherent phrases, almost as if it were communicating directly with me. My heart raced as I read the lines aloud, feeling a strange compulsion to continue. The gateway lies within the seeker. To invoke the unseen, one must understand the void. The words seemed to echo in the empty attic, their meaning both alluring and terrifying. I could feel a cold sweat forming on my brow as I struggled to make sense of the passage. It was as though the book was pulling me into its narrative, compelling me to unravel its mysteries. I closed the book with trembling hands, the creaking of the floorboards beneath me suddenly louder in the stillness. The shadows in the attic seemed to deepen, and I could no longer shake the feeling that I was not alone. The sense of being watched grew more intense, a palpable presence that seemed to close in around me. I left the attic that night with the book still on my mind, the unsettling feeling lingering long after I had closed the door behind me. Sleep eluded me as I lay in bed, my mind racing with thoughts of the book and its cryptic messages. It was clear that the discovery of the book was only the beginning of something far more unsettling. When morning came, I had hoped that sleep would have provided some clarity, but instead, I awoke with a profound sense of unease. The attic, with its dusty old treasures, had become a realm of dread. I told myself it was merely my imagination running wild, influenced by the mysterious nature of the book. Nevertheless, I felt compelled to return. As I ascended the stairs to the attic, the light filtering through the small windows seemed dimmer, casting elongated shadows that seemed to move on their own. My steps echoed unerringly loud in the silence, amplifying the tension in the air. The book lay exactly where I had left it, as if it had been waiting for me. I reached for it with a mixture of reluctance and curiosity, feeling its cold, leather cover against my fingertips. Opening it, I discovered that the pages had again shifted. The text and illustrations now appeared more detailed, almost as if the book were evolving. The symbols had become more complex, and some of the pages were filled with diagrams of rituals and incantations. Each page seemed to whisper secrets meant to be uncovered. I noticed subtle changes in the house's atmosphere. Objects would be slightly out of place, and I would hear faint whispers at night. At first, I attributed these disturbances to stress and the recent emotional turmoil of losing my grandmother. But the more I tried to ignore them, the more they intensified. One evening, as I sat in the living room, the temperature in the house dropped suddenly. My breath became visible in the air, and an unsettling chill settled over me. I was alone, or so I thought, when I heard a soft, almost imperceptible scratching sound coming from the direction of the attic. It was as if something, or someone, was trying to get out. I decided to investigate, though every instinct screamed at me to run. I slowly approached the attic door, the old wood creaking beneath my feet. The scratching sound grew louder as I got closer, now accompanied by a low, murmuring voice that was barely audible. My heart raced, but I forced myself to turn the key and unlock the door. As the door creaked open, a blast of icy air rushed out, making me stagger back. The attic was as I had left it, with the book lying in the center of the circle I had created. But now, the runes on the floor were disturbed, some of them smeared as if someone, or something, had been moving through them. I stepped into the attic, the shadows seeming to coil and shift around me. The scratching noise had stopped, but the whispering continued, now a clear, almost mocking tone. I approached the book cautiously, feeling a sense of dread wash over me. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the attic into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the oppressive blackness. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I could make out fragmented phrases, though their meaning eluded me. The flashlight beam landed on the book, which seemed to have shifted positions. The runes on the floor glowed faintly, a sickly green light that cast eerie shadows on the walls. I could see shapes forming in the darkness, figures that seemed to move just beyond the edge of my vision. I picked up the book, feeling its cold, heavy weight. The pages had changed again, the symbols and text now more elaborate and foreboding. One page depicted a figure standing at the edge of a dark abyss, with the words, "To know the beyond is to embrace the void." A chilling realization washed over me. The book was not just a relic, but a conduit, an instrument through which something could cross over from another realm. I felt a wave of panic, my mind racing to comprehend the implications of what I had inadvertently done. The flashlight flickered and dimmed, and the temperature in the attic dropped even further. I heard a low, guttural growl emanating from the darkness, and the shadows seemed to press closer, their forms becoming more defined. My breathing became rapid and shallow as I backed away from the book, my fear mounting. In a desperate bid to rid myself of the terror, I grabbed the book and ran, slamming the attic door behind me. The growling and whispering continued, now a cacophony of sound that seemed to reverberate through the house. I locked the door once more, the sound of the key turning in the lock offering little comfort. That night, as I tried to sleep, the whispers persisted. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling my mind with disturbing thoughts and images. I could hear the scratching sound again, this time coming from inside my room. It was as if the entity was trying to break through, to reach me no matter where I went. Sleep deprivation began to take its toll. I found myself drifting in and out of consciousness, my dreams filled with dark, shifting shapes and disembodied voices. The line between reality and nightmare began to blur, leaving me in a state of constant dread. I tried to rationalize the events, to convince myself that it was all a figment of my imagination. But the evidence was undeniable. The book, the disturbances, and the growing sense of being watched were real. Something had been awakened, and it was not content to remain hidden. In my desperation, I reached out to a local historian, someone who specialized in occult lore and ancient texts. I hoped that they could provide insight into the book and its dark history. I scheduled a meeting, hoping that their expertise would help me understand what I was dealing with and how to put an end to it. As I awaited the appointment, the sense of foreboding continued to grow. I could no longer ignore the feeling that something was coming, something that was drawing closer with each passing day. The shadows in the house seemed to grow darker, more menacing, and I could no longer escape the feeling that the book had opened a door that could not be closed. The day of my meeting with the historian arrived, and I felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps they could provide answers or, better yet, a solution to the growing horror that had invaded my life. I had not slept well, the nightmares and whispers intensifying as the days went on, but I was determined to find some form of resolution. The historian's office was in a small, cluttered building that seemed to ooze an air of ancient knowledge and mystery. The walls were lined with dusty bookshelves and strange artifacts. Dr. Margaret Wells, the historian, greeted me with a look of both curiosity and concern. She was a woman in her late 50s, her hair streaked with gray and her eyes sharp and perceptive. I explained the situation as best I could, recounting my discovery of the book, the disturbing events, and the growing sense of dread that had accompanied them. Dr. Wells listened intently, her expression growing more grave with each detail. When I finally showed her the book, her face went pale. She carefully examined it, her fingers tracing the intricate symbols and illustrations. Her silence was heavy, filled with unspoken understanding. "This book," she finally said, her voice trembling slightly, "is a grimoire of powerful and dangerous rituals. It's not just a collection of ancient knowledge, it's a guide to summoning entities from realms beyond our own. The ritual you performed was not just a test of knowledge, but a key to unlocking something that should remain sealed." Dr. Wells's words confirmed my worst fears. The presence I had felt, the shadows, and the whispers, they were all manifestations of something that had been unleashed. She explained that the book was known to historians as a cursed artifact associated with dark rituals and ancient, malevolent forces. "We must act quickly," she said, her urgency evident. "The longer the entity is free, the more power it gains. We need to perform a counter-ritual to close the gateway and banish the entity back to its realm." I followed Dr. Wells back to my house, my heart heavy with both hope and dread. We prepared for the counter-ritual, gathering materials and setting up the space in the attic where the initial ritual had been performed. Dr. Wells worked with precision, her movements deliberate as she arranged the candles and symbols. As the ritual began, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The shadows in the attic seemed to grow restless, swirling and twisting in response to the ritual's energy. The temperature dropped, and the whispering returned, now louder and more frantic. I could sense the entity's anger, its presence pressing in from all sides. Dr. Wells chanted ancient incantations, her voice strong and commanding. The candles flared and dimmed, casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. The runes on the floor glowed with an intense light, pushing back against the encroaching darkness. The air crackled with energy, and I could feel a palpable struggle between the forces at play. Just as the ritual reached its climax, the presence in the attic seemed to converge on a single point, a swirling mass of darkness that writhed and roared in fury. I could see the figure from the book, its cloaked form more distinct than ever, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. It was as if the entity was trying to resist being banished, clinging desperately to this realm. With a final, powerful chant, Dr. Wells completed the ritual. A blinding light erupted from the runes, filling the attic and pushing the darkness back. The entity let out a final, agonized scream before being drawn into the light, its form dissipating into the void. The light slowly faded, and the attic fell silent. The oppressive weight that had filled the space seemed to lift, leaving behind a sense of eerie calm. The shadows on the walls receded, and the temperature returned to normal. Dr. Wells and I surveyed the attic, the book now lying in the center of the circle, its pages still but its power seemingly subdued. The counter-ritual had worked, but the experience had left me shaken. Dr. Wells assured me that the entity had been banished and that the book's influence had been neutralized. But the experience had changed me. The shadows and whispers that had haunted me were gone, but the memories of what I had faced lingered. As Dr. Wells departed, I took one last look at the attic. The book remained, a reminder of the dark forces that had been unleashed and the fragile balance between worlds that had been restored. I knew that the house would never be the same, and neither would I. In the end, the book was locked away, and the attic door was sealed, but the echoes of what had happened would remain with me. The shadows may have been pushed back, but the knowledge of what lay beyond lingered, a constant reminder of the darkness that could be unleashed by curiosity and fear. A dark forest spirit. Have you ever walked through a forest so still that it feels like it's watching you, waiting for you to step out of line? That was exactly how I felt the day I crossed the boundary into the darkwood forest. It all started on an unusually warm autumn day. My friends and I had decided to spend the weekend at a cabin we rented deep in the woods. It was a charming old place with creaky floorboards and a fireplace that crackled cheerfully. We were looking forward to a few days of hiking, storytelling, and escaping the clamor of city life. Little did we know, the forest we were about to explore had a reputation, one that was seldom spoken of but often feared. The cabin was nestled on the edge of a vast forest, its towering trees seeming to stretch into eternity. The Darkwood Forest, as it was known among the locals, had always been shrouded in mystery. Stories about it were passed down through generations, whispers of strange occurrences and eerie sightings. None of us took them seriously. After all, who believes in ghost stories when there's a beer cooler and a deck of cards waiting? On the first day, everything was perfect. The sun filtered through the branches, casting playful shadows on the forest floor. We hiked along well-trodden paths, chatting and laughing. It wasn't until the second day, when we decided to stray from the marked trails, that things began to change. "Let's see where this path leads," suggested Mark, one of my friends, pointing to a narrow trail that seemed to wind deeper into the forest. The others, eager for a bit of adventure, agreed. I was hesitant but followed anyway, intrigued by the possibility of discovering something new. As we ventured further, the forest grew quieter. The birdsong faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against our ears. It was an unsettling contrast to the day before. The air felt colder, heavier, and every crunch of leaves underfoot seemed to echo unnervingly. We laughed nervously, trying to shake off the growing unease. After walking for what felt like hours, we came to a clearing. At its center stood a large, ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches twisting like the fingers of a skeletal hand. Its trunk was covered in strange, swirling symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. The symbols looked almost alive. "Look at this," Mark said, his voice tinged with a mix of excitement and nervousness. "Isn't it cool?" The rest of us were less enthusiastic. Something about the tree didn't sit right with me. It felt like a marker, a boundary that we had crossed. I noticed an odd stillness in the air, as if the forest was holding its breath. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's getting late." Reluctantly, we turned back, but the journey felt longer and more treacherous than before. The path that had seemed so clear now appeared convoluted, twisting in ways that made us question if we had taken a wrong turn. The once familiar forest now seemed alien, and shadows seemed to flicker and shift at the edge of our vision. When we finally emerged from the forest and returned to the cabin, the sense of relief was palpable. But as we settled in for the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us back. It was as if the forest had marked us in some way, and we were now under its watchful gaze. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as a cold shiver ran down my spine. The darkness outside seemed thicker, more oppressive. Every creak of the cabin felt magnified, and I couldn't help but feel that we were no longer alone. The stories of the Darkwood Forest echoed in my mind, blending with my growing sense of unease. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling sound, like whispers carried on the wind. I told myself it was just the trees outside or perhaps a stray animal. But deep down, I knew it was something more. Something that had been awakened by our trespass. Sleep eventually claimed me, but it was restless. I dreamt of dark, tangled woods and eyes watching from the shadows. I woke up several times, each time feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. As the sun rose, I hoped that the night's terrors were just a figment of my imagination. But the unease remained, settling over us like a fog that refused to lift. We decided to stick to the trails for the rest of our stay, avoiding the clearing and the ominous tree. But the sense of being watched never fully went away. The real trouble began on our third day, when things started to go wrong in ways that defied simple explanation. It started with small things, a misplaced item here, a door left open there. Nothing major, but enough to keep us on edge. And then, as we ventured back into the forest, we noticed the signs. Markers that were not there before, branches arranged in strange patterns, symbols etched into the ground. It was as if the forest was trying to communicate something, or perhaps it was trying to guide us somewhere. We were not alone. The forest was alive, and it had taken an interest in us. Our final day in the cabin should have been a respite, a chance to shake off the lingering unease that had taken hold. But the forest had other plans. The morning began with a sense of foreboding that none of us could quite shake. We tried to act normal, engaging in casual conversation and making light of the previous day's oddities. But every so often, one of us would glance towards the trees, a shadow of apprehension crossing our face. By noon, we decided to take one last hike. We wanted to end our trip on a high note, hoping that a return to the familiar trails would help us forget the unsettling feeling that had plagued us. We set out with an air of determination, but the forest seemed less inviting than before. The usual cheerful chirping of birds was replaced by an almost ominous silence, broken only by the crunch of our footsteps on the leaf-covered ground. We followed a different path, one that was supposed to lead us to a scenic overlook. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees, once distant and majestic, now felt like towering giants, their branches intertwining above us to form a canopy that blocked out the sunlight. It was as if we were walking through a tunnel of green, with no clear end in sight. It was Mark who first noticed the change. "Doesn't this trail seem different?" he asked, his voice laced with unease. "It feels like we've been walking for hours." I looked around and had to agree. The landmarks we had been using to gauge our location were no longer visible. The path had become a maze of turns and twists that seemed to loop back on themselves. I tried to reassure everyone, but my own anxiety was mounting. As the day wore on, the forest grew colder. A chill seeped into our bones despite the bright sun overhead. We stopped to take a break, hoping that a moment of rest would alleviate the mounting tension. That's when we noticed something strange, an old, wooden sign half buried in the dirt. The letters on it were barely legible, but the word danger was clear. "What's this doing here?" Lisa, another friend, asked. Her face was pale as she traced the letters with her finger. "I don't remember seeing this before." The sign was unsettling, but we pressed on, determined to reach our destination. The path eventually opened up to a small clearing with a rocky outcrop that provided a decent view. We took a moment to appreciate the scenery, but the sense of unease never fully left us. As we prepared to head back, I noticed something odd about the clearing. There were small piles of stones arranged in neat stacks, as if someone had meticulously placed them there. They were too orderly to be natural, and the sight of them sent a shiver down my spine. "I don't like this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Let's get out of here." We retraced our steps, but the forest seemed to have changed its layout. Paths that had been clear were now overgrown, and familiar landmarks were missing. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their branches scratching at us as we pushed through. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring to keep us trapped within its depths. The sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. The growing darkness only heightened our sense of disorientation. We tried to stay calm, but the growing feeling of being watched made it hard to focus. Each of us had the distinct sensation that eyes were following us from the darkened woods. Eventually, we stumbled upon a small, dilapidated cabin hidden among the trees. It was unlike the cozy, well-kept cabin we had rented. This one was decrepit, with broken windows and a sagging roof. It looked as though it had been abandoned for years. "We can't stay here," Mark said, his voice trembling. "It's not safe." But as nightfall approached, we had little choice. The forest seemed to have swallowed the path back, and we were running out of time. We decided to take shelter in the old cabin, hoping it would provide some protection from the encroaching darkness. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. We lit a few candles and gathered around them, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. But the unsettling feeling only grew stronger. Every creak of the old cabin seemed amplified, and the shadows danced on the walls, taking on sinister shapes. As the night wore on, we huddled together, trying to keep warm and calm. We spoke in hushed tones, discussing our options and trying to rationalize the strange events we had experienced. But deep down, we all felt the same sense of dread. Around midnight, the sounds began. Soft, whispering voices seemed to drift through the walls, too faint to understand but too clear to ignore. The whispers grew louder, becoming almost a constant murmur that made it impossible to sleep. The cabin felt like it was closing in on us, the walls pressing in with an oppressive weight. At one point, Lisa swore she saw a figure outside the window, tall and thin, with eyes that glowed in the darkness. But when we looked, there was nothing there. Just the dense, shadowy forest stretching endlessly. Sleep was elusive, and when I did manage to doze off, I was plagued by nightmares of being lost in the forest, chased by unseen forces. Each time I woke, the fear was more palpable, the darkness outside more suffocating. When dawn finally broke, we were exhausted and on edge. We packed up quickly, eager to leave the cabin and the forest behind. But as we left, the strange occurrences didn't stop. The forest seemed to be shifting around us, and no matter which way we turned, it felt like we were being guided deeper into its labyrinth. By the time we emerged from the trees, the forest was bathed in the harsh light of day, but the sense of dread remained. We hurried back to the cabin, desperate to get away from the forest and its oppressive atmosphere. As we packed up and prepared to leave, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with us. The forest had marked us, and its influence seemed to linger, casting a long shadow over our memories of that trip. We left the cabin and the forest behind, but the shadows of our experience refused to let go. It was as if the forest had left an imprint on us, and no matter how far we traveled, its presence clung to our every thought. The drive back was eerily quiet. We spoke little, each lost in our own thoughts, trying to process the events of the past few days. It was only once we reached the city and began to unpack that we realized how deeply unsettled we were. The days that followed were filled with a creeping unease. Small things started to go wrong. Items went missing, lights flickered without reason, and we all had vivid dreams of the forest. I would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that I could hear the whispers from the old cabin. I tried to convince myself that it was just stress and fatigue, but then the occurrences began to escalate. Mark, who had been staying with me temporarily, started seeing the figure Lisa had described. He would catch glimpses of it out of the corner of his eye, tall, thin, with glowing eyes. Each time, the figure vanished before he could get a good look, but the sensation of being watched was undeniable. Lisa, who had always been a skeptic of the supernatural, began to experience a sense of dread whenever she was alone. She reported hearing faint rustling noises outside her apartment and seeing fleeting shadows in her peripheral vision. It was as if the forest had not just touched us, but had somehow followed us into our daily lives. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I noticed an odd pattern in the condensation on my kitchen window. It resembled the swirling symbols we had seen on the ancient oak tree. I tried to dismiss it as coincidence or a trick of the light, but the sight unsettled me. The symbols seemed to pulse and shift as if they were alive, just like those on the tree. Desperate for answers, we decided to investigate the forest's legend further. We reached out to locals and did some research, hoping to uncover the truth behind the darkwood forest. What we discovered was both fascinating and chilling. According to local folklore, the forest was cursed long ago by a druid who was wronged by the townsfolk. He had placed a powerful spell on the land, vowing that anyone who trespassed would be haunted by the spirit of the forest. The stories spoke of a malevolent entity that would stalk its victims, feeding off their fear until they were driven mad. The more we learned, the more our experiences seemed to align with the legends. We began to see connections between the symbols, the whispers, and the strange occurrences in our lives. It was as if the forest had a will of its own, capable of reaching out and manipulating our reality. Our fear intensified as we continued to experience inexplicable phenomena. We found ourselves avoiding the dark and becoming increasingly paranoid. Simple tasks, like going to the grocery store or walking down the street, became fraught with anxiety. The feeling of being watched was ever present, and we couldn't escape the sense that the forest was still pursuing us. One night, I had a particularly vivid dream. I was back in the forest, standing in front of the ancient oak tree. The symbols on the trunk glowed with an eerie light, and I could hear the whispers clearly now. They were not just random sounds, but seemed to form coherent sentences, taunting me with our transgressions. The tree's branches reached out like the hands of a giant, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread as I was pulled toward it. I woke up gasping, my heart racing. The following day, I found an old, leather-bound journal in the attic of my house. It appeared to be a diary from someone who had lived in the area long ago. The entries were filled with disturbing accounts of strange occurrences and supernatural phenomena. The last entry was dated just before the writer vanished without a trace. The final words were a cryptic message: "The forest never lets go." The discovery of the journal only deepened our fear. It was as if the forest had a life of its own, constantly reaching out and drawing us back into its grip. We felt trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. As the days turned into weeks, our once vibrant and carefree lives were overshadowed by the lingering terror of the darkwood forest. The spirit seemed to have a grip on us that we couldn't shake, and we began to fear that it would only be a matter of time before it claimed us entirely. Our once close-knit group of friends grew distant, each of us struggling with our own personal demons and fears. We rarely saw each other, and when we did, the conversation always seemed to circle back to the forest and its haunting presence. It became clear that we needed to confront our fears head-on, but the idea of returning to the forest was terrifying. We debated whether we should try to break the curse or simply find a way to move on with our lives, but the forest's grip was relentless. It was as if it was feeding off our fear, growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, I received a phone call from Mark. His voice was shaky, and he spoke in urgent, fragmented sentences. "It's happening again. I think it's found me. I don't know what to do." Before I could respond, the call was abruptly cut off. Panic surged through me, and I rushed to Mark's apartment, hoping that he was safe. As I arrived, I noticed that the streetlights flickered erratically, and a dense fog seemed to roll in from the direction of the forest. When I reached Mark's door, it was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside, calling out for him. The apartment was eerily silent, and the air was cold, despite the warm evening outside. As I searched the apartment, I noticed strange symbols etched into the walls, symbols similar to those on the ancient oak tree. My heart pounded as I realized that the forest had somehow found its way into Mark's home. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I could sense that something malevolent was close by. In the corner of the room, I saw Mark's journal lying open on the floor. Its pages were filled with frantic, disjointed writing. The last entry was a scrawled message: "The forest is closing in. It's coming for me." Just then, I heard a faint whisper behind me. I turned around, but the room was empty. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I felt a cold breeze brush against my skin. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow with an unnatural light, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. In a state of panic, I fled the apartment, feeling the presence of the forest closing in on me. The fog outside was thicker than before, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. I could hear the whispers growing louder, and the sense of dread was nearly suffocating. As I reached my car, I glanced back at Mark's apartment. The windows were dark, and the symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with an eerie light. I knew that something terrible had happened, and the forest's grip on us had become even more sinister. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of anxiety and fear. The fog seemed to follow me, its tendrils creeping along the sides of the road, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the darkness. The whispers from Mark's apartment echoed in my mind, growing louder with every mile. When I finally arrived home, I bolted the door behind me and checked every window, feeling an irrational but overwhelming need to secure myself. The sense of being pursued was almost palpable, and I felt as though I was a mere step away from being pulled back into the forest's grasp. That night, the nightmares returned with a vengeance. I dreamt of wandering through an endless labyrinth of trees, with the dark spirit of the forest chasing me relentlessly. I could hear the whispers clearly now, and they were no longer just random sounds, but clear, haunting voices that seemed to call my name. I woke up gasping for breath, drenched in sweat, and with the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone in my own home. The next morning, I decided to confront the reality of our situation. I knew we couldn't continue living in fear, and if we were ever to break the curse, or at least understand what we were up against, we needed to return to the forest and face whatever it was that had claimed us. I contacted Lisa and Mark's family to check on them. Lisa was still shaken but had managed to maintain some semblance of normalcy, though she reported similar occurrences, strange noises, fleeting shadows, and a pervasive sense of dread. Mark's family, however, was frantic. They had not heard from him and were growing increasingly worried. I felt a knot of guilt tighten in my stomach. I was supposed to be helping, not abandoning my friends to the forest's malevolent grasp. As evening approached, I gathered a few supplies, flashlights, extra batteries, and a couple of old maps of the area. I didn't know what we would find, but I knew we had to confront whatever was haunting us if we were ever to find peace. With a heavy heart and a growing sense of dread, I set out for the darkwood forest one last time. The forest was as foreboding as ever. The fog had thickened, and the trees seemed to close in even more tightly, their branches intertwining like gnarled fingers reaching for the sky. The path we had taken before was now nearly unrecognizable, swallowed by the encroaching undergrowth. It was as if the forest was actively trying to obscure any trace of its paths. I ventured deeper into the forest, guided only by the dim beam of my flashlight and the ever-present feeling of being watched. The symbols I had seen on the oak tree seemed to appear everywhere now, etched into the bark, scrawled in the dirt, and even appearing in the patterns of the leaves. The whispers began again, faint but insistent, echoing through the trees. It was a haunting melody of disjointed phrases and murmured threats. My mind raced as I searched for the clearing with the ancient oak tree, hoping to find some clue or ritual that might help us break the curse. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to shift and change, making it nearly impossible to keep track of my location. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. Then, I saw it. Through the fog and the trees, the clearing emerged, and there stood the ancient oak tree, just as we had left it. But something was different. The symbols on the tree now glowed with an eerie, sickly light, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and twist on their own. My flashlight flickered, and I could hear the whispering voices clearly now. They were not just murmuring but chanting in a rhythmic, almost hypnotic manner. I approached the tree cautiously, trying to make sense of the symbols. They seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and the whispers seemed to resonate with them, creating a disorienting effect. As I studied the symbols, a figure appeared from the shadows. It was tall, thin, and shrouded in darkness, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The presence was both terrifying and strangely familiar. It was the same figure Mark had described, but it was more real now, more menacing. The figure extended a hand, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. I could feel an overwhelming sense of despair and helplessness, as if the forest was feeding on my fear. I tried to focus, to make sense of the symbols and the figure's intentions, but the sense of dread was nearly paralyzing. The figure seemed to beckon me towards the tree, and as I stepped closer, I felt an icy hand grasp my shoulder. I turned around, but there was no one there, only the swirling fog and the oppressive silence. The whispers continued, growing more insistent. I reached out to touch the symbols on the tree, hoping to find some way to break the curse. As my fingers brushed the bark, the symbols flared with a blinding light, and the whispers turned into a cacophony of voices. I felt a surge of energy, both terrifying and exhilarating. The forest seemed to pulse with a rhythm that resonated with my very soul. In that moment, I understood the truth. The forest was not just a place, but a living entity, bound by the curse and feeding off the fear of those who trespassed. The figure was a manifestation of the forest's will, a guardian that ensured no one could leave unscathed. The light from the symbols intensified, and I felt a powerful force pulling me towards the tree. The whispers became a deafening roar, and I struggled to break free. My mind raced as I realized that the only way to escape the forest's grip was to confront my own fears, to understand and accept the power that the forest held over us. As the light reached its peak, I felt a sudden, sharp pain, a piercing sensation that cut through the darkness. I was thrust back, and the light abruptly faded. The forest fell silent, and the oppressive feeling of dread lifted, if only slightly. When I finally regained my bearings, the clearing was empty. The tree stood alone, its symbols now dim and lifeless. The figure was gone, and the whispers had ceased. I was left with a profound sense of emptiness and relief. I stumbled out of the forest, the fog lifting as I left its confines. The oppressive weight that had hung over me seemed to dissipate, though the fear and uncertainty remained. The forest had revealed its true nature, a living, breathing entity that thrived on the fear it instilled in its victims. As I emerged from the forest, I looked back one last time. The trees stood silent, their shadows long and dark. The darkwood forest had claimed its toll, but I had survived. The curse had not been broken, but I had confronted the source of her terror, and for now, that was enough. The forest would remain a haunting memory, a place where fear and darkness converged. But I knew that as long as I carried the knowledge of what I had encountered, I could face whatever came next. The forest's grip had lessened, but its shadow would always be with me. The spirit's call. Have you ever wondered what happens when curiosity pushes you to the edge, to a place where reality blurs with the unknown? It was one of those humid summer evenings where the air felt thick enough to taste, and the cicadas sang a relentless song. My friends and I, a tight-knit group of misfits, gathered at Sarah's house. The familiar scent of popcorn wafted through the living room, and the dim light cast long shadows against the walls, making the place feel more like a haunted house than a cozy hangout. "Let's do something different tonight," Sarah said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. She had this uncanny ability to ignite our wildest ideas. "What do you have in mind?" I asked, half-jokingly. "A spirit board," she replied, grinning. "I found one at a garage sale. It's supposed to be real, like actually used by people." The laughter that erupted was contagious, filled with the typical teenage bravado that made us feel invincible. But even as I laughed, a small knot of unease twisted in my stomach. We had all heard the stories, friends who had played with the board and claimed to have experienced strange occurrences. But who could resist the thrill? After some playful arguments, we finally agreed to give it a try. We gathered around the board, which looked worn and ancient, as if it had seen things we could only imagine. The planchette sat in the center, waiting. "Okay, everyone, let's hold hands," Sarah instructed. We complied, our palms sweaty against each other. As the first letters spelled out HELLO, a chill swept through the room. I tried to shake off the feeling, surely it was just the draft from the open window. But my heart raced. I could feel it, something shifted in the air, a sense of anticipation that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Is anyone here?" Sarah asked, her voice wavering just a bit. Suddenly, the planchette moved again. "Why, yes." The collective gasps filled the room, each breath hanging heavily, suffocating in the charged atmosphere. My instincts screamed for me to stop, but the thrill of the unknown drew us deeper into the game. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to maintain a facade of bravado. "Caroline," it spelled, the letters appearing slowly, deliberately. My stomach dropped. I had never heard of anyone named Caroline connected to this board, but the name felt familiar somehow, like a whisper from the past. "Is there a message you want to share?" Sarah leaned in closer, her face illuminated by the flickering candlelight. "DNGR," the planchette spelled, sending an icy shiver down my spine. I glanced at my friends, their expressions mirrored my own mix of excitement and fear. "Okay, that's enough," I said, my voice more assertive than I felt. "Let's stop before we freak ourselves out." But before anyone could respond, the lights flickered violently, plunging us into darkness. Panic surged through me. I fumbled for my phone, its screen lighting up like a beacon in the suffocating black. "Sarah, what was that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't know," she replied, her tone just above a whisper. "Maybe it's just a power outage." I wanted to believe her, but something deep inside me felt wrong. The air felt thicker, almost electric, as if charged with an unseen presence. Just as I started to feel a sense of normalcy returning, the candles sputtered, casting elongated shadows that danced eerily along the walls. "Let's get out of here," one of my friends said, but before anyone could move, a loud crash echoed from the kitchen, followed by the sound of glass shattering. My heart raced. "What was that?" "I'll check it out," Sarah said, standing up despite the protests. "No, wait." I reached for her, but she was already gone, swallowed by the shadows. We sat in tense silence, exchanging glances filled with fear. I could feel my pulse throbbing in my ears, drowning out the distant sounds of the night. Each second felt like an eternity, the weight of dread settling heavily on my chest. Then, I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible but clear enough to send chills down my spine. "Get out." I froze, terror rooting me to the spot. I strained to hear more, my eyes darting around the dimly lit room. My friends looked just as frightened, their faces pale and eyes wide. "Sarah?" I called, my voice trembling. Nothing. As I stood, the floorboards creaked beneath my weight, the sound echoing ominously. I felt the air shift again, cold and foreboding, wrapping around me like a shroud. The game had awakened something, and now it wanted us to listen. I stepped toward the doorway, the dim light from my phone illuminating the narrow hallway that led to the kitchen. My breath came in shallow bursts, my chest tightening with each step. The shadows seemed to writhe and shift in my peripheral vision, but when I looked directly at them, nothing moved. "Sarah?" I called again, my voice barely a whisper. A scraping sound echoed from the kitchen, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. My pulse quickened. Every instinct told me to turn around, to leave this house and never look back. But something stronger, curiosity or maybe stupidity, drove me forward. As I approached the kitchen, the cold air hit me like a wall. It was unnatural, the kind of chill that seeped into your bones and made you feel as though you'd never be warm again. I could see my breath in the light from my phone, a thin mist that curled into the darkness ahead. "Sarah?" My voice cracked. There was no response, only the low hum of the refrigerator and that persistent scraping noise. I stepped into the kitchen, and my phone's light swept across the room. The table was overturned, chairs scattered, and the window over the sink was wide open, the curtains billowing in the breeze. Glass littered the floor, shards of what looked like a drinking glass, shattered in a wide arc across the tiles. But Sarah was nowhere to be found. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the logical part of my brain that was trying to explain this away. Maybe she went outside to investigate the noise? Maybe this was all some elaborate prank? But deep down, I knew none of those explanations made sense. Just as I turned to go back to the living room, something caught my eye. It was subtle, a slight movement reflected in the glass of the window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned the light from my phone toward the reflection. And there, behind me, in the doorway I had just come through, stood a figure. I whipped around, but the hallway was empty. I felt like I was drowning, my throat closing up with fear. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, frozen to the spot. Suddenly, I heard footsteps, soft but deliberate, approaching from the darkness of the hallway. My friends had to be playing some kind of cruel joke on me. But as the sound grew closer, the weight of the air around me became oppressive, heavy with a presence I couldn't explain. The footsteps stopped just outside the kitchen door. I held my breath, not daring to move. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again, the same figure, standing just beyond the threshold of the room. But this time, it was clearer. A woman. She stood there, her eyes wide and vacant, her skin pale as moonlight. Her hair hung in damp, tangled strands around her face, and her mouth was twisted into a grimace of sorrow or anger, I couldn't tell which. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, staring at me with hollow eyes that seemed to see right through me. "Caroline," I whispered, the name slipping from my lips before I even realized I had spoken it. As if in response, the figure stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the broken glass. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get out of that house, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the overwhelming sense of dread. Just as she reached the edge of the light, the figure stopped. Her expression shifted, her grimace softening into something almost mournful. For a moment, I thought she might speak, but instead, she simply raised one hand and pointed to the overturned table. I followed her gaze, my eyes falling on the spirit board. The planchette was no longer in the center of the board. It had moved, spelling out a new word in the faint glow of my phone. Run. Without thinking, I bolted from the kitchen, my footsteps pounding against the hardwood floor as I raced back to the living room. My friends were still there, their faces twisted in confusion and fear. What happened? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. I couldn't speak. I could barely think. My chest heaved, and my body trembled as I pointed toward the kitchen, trying to make sense of the words that wouldn't come. We need to leave, I finally managed to say. Now. But before anyone could move, the lights flickered again, plunging us back into that suffocating darkness. This time, there was no playful laughter, no nervous giggles. Just the sound of our collective breathing, shallow and uneven. And then, from the far corner of the room, we heard it, a soft, low whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. Caroline. I felt the blood drain from my face as the whisper echoed through the room. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a presence that seemed to wrap itself around each of us. The air thickened, and I could feel every hair on the back of my neck stand on end. My friends were frozen, their eyes wide with terror. Did you hear that? Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. We all nodded, too afraid to speak. The name, Caroline, hung in the air like a bad omen. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. The spirit board, the strange movements, the figure in the kitchen, it all felt connected, but none of it made sense. Was Caroline a ghost, or was this just a cruel trick our minds were playing on us? We need to go, I repeated, this time more urgently. I grabbed my bag, my hands trembling as I stuffed my phone inside. We can't stay here. But just as I turned toward the door, the temperature in the room dropped again. This time, it was more intense, like we had been plunged into a freezer. I could see the frost forming on the windows, tiny crystals creeping along the glass like spider webs. My breath came out in ragged, visible puffs. We can't just leave, Sarah protested, her voice shaking but determined. What if it follows us? Follows us? Emma said, her eyes wide with fear. What do you mean? Before Sarah could answer, the whisper came again, louder this time. Caroline. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice wasn't just coming from the room anymore, it was inside my head, creeping into my thoughts, filling every corner of my mind with that one relentless name. We have to end this, Sarah said, her face pale but resolute. We started something, and we need to finish it. How? I asked, my voice cracking. How do we stop it? Sarah looked down at the spirit board still lying on the floor. We need to say goodbye. Properly. Are you serious? Emma's voice was sharp with panic. You want to go back to that thing? After everything that just happened? I don't think we have a choice, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. If we don't close the door we opened, it's just going to keep getting worse. I wanted to argue, to tell her that nothing about this was logical, that the last thing I wanted was to touch that cursed board again. But deep down, I knew she was right. We had disturbed something, and now it was up to us to put it back. Reluctantly, we all gathered around the board once more, sitting cross-legged on the floor like before. The planchette was still resting on the word run, but none of us dared move it. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of our nervous breathing. "Everyone, put your hands on the planchette," Sarah instructed. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering just above the wooden piece. The memory of the figure in the kitchen, of Caroline's empty eyes, flashed through my mind. But I forced myself to place my fingers on the planchette, feeling the cold surface beneath my fingertips. "Now what?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We ask it to leave," Sarah said. "We say goodbye." I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. "Is anyone still here?" Sarah asked, her voice calm but firm. For a moment, nothing happened. The planchette remained still under our fingers, and I almost allowed myself to hope that whatever we had summoned was gone. But then, slowly, deliberately, the planchette began to move. Why, yes. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I could feel the terror rising in my chest again, but I forced myself to stay calm. We had to finish this. We had to see it through. "We're sorry for disturbing you," Sarah continued, her voice wavering slightly. "We didn't mean any harm. Please, we just want to say goodbye." For a few agonizing seconds, the planchette didn't move. Then, with a sudden jerk, it slid across the board. Godbye. A heavy silence settled over the room. We all stared at the board, hardly daring to breathe. Was that it? Had it really worked? Just as I began to relax, there was a loud bang from the front door, as if someone, or something, had slammed into it. We all jumped to our feet, panic surging through the group. "What was that?" Emma cried, backing away from the door. "I don't know," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "But we need to leave. Now." We didn't need any more convincing. Grabbing our bags, we bolted for the door, practically tripping over each other in our rush to get out. The moment I stepped outside, the cold air hit me, but it was nothing compared to the suffocating presence we had left behind in that house. As we ran down the street, my heart still pounding in my chest, I glanced back over my shoulder at Sarah's house. The windows were dark, the curtains still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching us. We didn't stop running until we reached the end of the block. Finally, out of breath and shaking, we huddled together under the dim streetlight, our faces pale and terrified. "Do you think it's over?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. I wanted to say yes, to reassure her that we were safe, that the nightmare was behind us. But I couldn't. Because deep down, I knew that whatever we had awakened wasn't done with us yet. The night felt colder now, like the air itself had been tainted by something we couldn't understand. We huddled under the streetlight, still shaken from what had happened. No one spoke. We were all too afraid to break the silence, as if doing so might invite something worse. "We can't go back there," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Not tonight." "Agreed," Sarah said, her face pale and tight with fear. "But we have to figure this out. That thing, whatever it is, it knows us now. It won't just let us walk away." A deep unease settled over me. Sarah's words hit harder than I wanted to admit. I couldn't shake the feeling that Caroline, if that was even her name, was still with us, lurking just beyond the reach of the streetlight's glow. "We should go to my place," Emma suggested, her voice trembling. "It's close, and my parents won't be home until late. We can figure out what to do from there." Reluctantly, we agreed. We walked in silence, the sound of our footsteps echoing through the empty streets. Every shadow seemed alive, every rustle of leaves or distant creak of a door made my heart jump in my chest. The farther we got from Sarah's house, the more I felt the weight of our situation pressing down on me. By the time we reached Emma's house, my nerves were frayed. Her home was a typical suburban two-story, its porch light casting a faint, welcoming glow. But even here, in the familiarity of her front yard, I couldn't shake the sense of dread that clung to me like a second skin. Once inside, we collapsed onto the couch, the tension between us still thick and unspoken. Emma grabbed a few blankets and threw one over me. I pulled it tight around my shoulders, trying to fend off the chill that had burrowed into my bones. "What do we do now?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," Sarah said, her eyes focused, though I could see the fear hiding just beneath the surface. It wasn't just a random spirit. There's something more to this, something connected to Caroline. I didn't want to hear it. The idea of diving deeper into whatever horror we had unleashed felt like madness. But at the same time, I knew we couldn't ignore it. Not after what had happened. Not with that presence still lingering in the back of my mind, like a shadow I couldn't shake. "Do you think she's still here?" I asked, my voice barely audible, afraid of the answer. No one responded at first, but the look in their eyes said it all. "I think," Sarah started slowly, "she might not be done with us yet." The next few hours were agonizing. We tried to distract ourselves with mundane things, movies, snacks, pointless conversation, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made my skin crawl. I could feel Caroline's presence, hovering just out of sight. It was after midnight when Sarah finally broke the silence again. "I've been thinking," she said, sitting up on the couch. "We need to find out more about her. There has to be a reason she came to us." "Do you really want to know more?" Emma asked, her eyes wide with fear. "What if we just leave it alone? What if we're making it worse?" "We don't have a choice," Sarah replied. "She came to us for a reason. Maybe she needs something. Or maybe she's angry about something. Either way, we need to know what we're dealing with." I didn't want to agree, but deep down, I knew she was right. Caroline's name had been spelled out on the board. She had given us warnings. And then there was the figure I had seen in Sarah's kitchen, her sorrowful expression burned into my mind. She wasn't just some random spirit passing through, she was tied to us now. "Where do we start?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Online," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. "Maybe there's something about Caroline connected to this area." It felt absurd, sitting in Emma's living room, using Google to search for ghosts. But what else could we do? We scrolled through countless articles, old records, and local folklore. Hours passed in tense silence, each search coming up empty. I was beginning to lose hope when Emma gasped, her eyes glued to her screen. "Guys, I think I found something," she whispered, turning the phone toward us. The article was an old one, from a local news archive. The headline read, "Tragic Death of Caroline Grayson, Local Teen Found Drowned in Family Pool." The date was from nearly 20 years ago. My heart sank as I read the details. Caroline had been only 17 when she died, her death ruled an accident. But the article mentioned rumors, whispers of something more sinister, a mystery that had never been solved. She lived in this neighborhood, Emma said, her voice trembling. That house. Sarah, your house was hers. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was one I didn't want to see. Do you think she's trying to tell us something? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I don't know, Sarah said, her face pale. But I think we've opened a door we can't close. Not until we understand what happened to her. An ominous shadow. Have you ever looked at your shadow and wondered, what if it had a life of its own? What if, one day, it decided to move in a way that didn't quite match your steps? That thought haunted me, though I never expected it to become my reality. It all started on a calm Tuesday evening, one of those perfectly normal nights where nothing should feel out of place. I was returning from work, mentally preparing myself for the comfort of my small, suburban home. The routine was simple: make dinner, relax in front of the TV, and eventually collapse into bed. But that night, as I walked down my quiet street, something felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, almost as if the night itself was watching me. I brushed off the feeling, attributing it to a long day at work. I had been under a lot of pressure lately, and it wasn't unusual for stress to manifest in strange ways. But the unease lingered. As I passed under a streetlight, I saw it, a shadow that wasn't mine. At first, I didn't realize anything was wrong. I was too distracted, my thoughts still caught up in the stress of the day. It was only after I glanced down that I noticed something was off. The shadow beside me wasn't following my movements. It stood there, still, as I took a few steps forward. My heart skipped a beat, a cold chill creeping up my spine. I froze, and so did the shadow, but not in sync with me. It was delayed, moving a fraction of a second after I did, almost as if it was hesitating or thinking. I shook my head, blinking a few times to clear the fog of disbelief. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, I told myself. But as I moved again, the shadow remained just a step behind, mimicking my actions in a way that felt wrong. By the time I reached my driveway, I was on edge. My shadow had always been a silent companion, a reflection of myself, nothing more. But this felt different. There was an almost tangible presence to it, something I couldn't quite put into words. I looked around, hoping to find an explanation. But the street was empty, eerily quiet, with only the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of traffic to accompany me. Inside my house, I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. I flicked on the lights, hoping the bright, warm glow would dispel the lingering unease. It helped, but only just. I busied myself with dinner, trying to focus on the mundane tasks of chopping vegetables and boiling water. Still, the thought of that shadow lingered in the back of my mind, like an itch I couldn't scratch. Later that evening, as I sat in the living room with the TV flickering softly in the background, I felt it again, that sensation of being watched. I glanced toward the window, half expecting to see something lurking in the darkness outside. But there was nothing. Only my reflection, faint in the glass, and behind it, the shadow. It shouldn't have been visible in the dim light, yet there it was. I couldn't make out its form clearly, but the shape was unmistakable, tall, slender, and unnervingly still. My breath caught in my throat. It was standing right behind me, like a silent observer. I whipped around, my pulse racing. But of course, there was nothing there. Just the empty room, bathed in the soft glow of the TV. I let out a shaky laugh, trying to calm myself. "You're just imagining things," I muttered under my breath. "It's the stress." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Something felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the shadow anymore. It was the house, the air, even my own skin. Everything felt off, as if reality itself had shifted slightly, leaving me teetering on the edge of something unknown. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, every creak of the house sending a jolt of fear through my chest. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. When I woke the next morning, the first thing I did was check my shadow. It was there, of course, perfectly normal, following my every move like it always had. I felt a wave of relief, convincing myself that the strange occurrences from the previous night had been nothing more than an overactive imagination. But that sense of normalcy didn't last long. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more oppressive. The shadow, once a harmless silhouette, seemed to take on a life of its own. It was subtle at first, just little things, like how it seemed slightly delayed in its movements, or how it would linger in the corners of my vision even when there shouldn't have been enough light to cast it. I started avoiding mirrors, windows, any surface that could reflect back that eerie presence. But it was always there, lurking just out of sight. The worst part was that no one else seemed to notice. I tried talking to my friends about it, but they just laughed it off, telling me I was stressed and needed a vacation. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just imagining things. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The shadow wasn't just a trick of the light, it was something else, something I couldn't explain. And as the days went on, it became more real, more tangible, as if it was slowly gaining substance, feeding off my fear. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting for something. But what? And why me? These questions haunted me as the shadow grew bolder, inching closer with every passing day. And then, one night, it spoke. The sound was barely more than a whisper, faint and distorted, like a distant echo carried on the wind. I was sitting in the kitchen, late at night, staring into the darkness outside the window. The house was quiet, and I was alone. At first, I thought it was just the wind, the kind of creaking you hear when a house settles. But this was different. It wasn't the kind of sound you could easily dismiss. It was deliberate, purposeful. It felt like words. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the table. My eyes darted toward the window, but all I saw was my own reflection staring back at me, pale and wide-eyed. My shadow stretched out behind me, longer than it should have been in the dim kitchen light. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. I was just tired, stressed. But then I heard it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. A low, almost inaudible voice whispered my name. A chill ran down my spine, cold as ice. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned around, expecting, dreading, what I might see. But the room was empty. No one was there. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I felt the irrational urge to run, to get out of the house, away from whatever was watching me. I stood up, knocking the chair over in my haste. The clatter echoed through the silent house, but I barely noticed. My eyes were locked on the floor, where my shadow twisted and contorted, its edges blurred and shifting as though it were alive. I backed away, stumbling toward the doorway. I could feel it now, the oppressive weight of its presence bearing down on me, cold and suffocating. The voice came again, clearer this time, though still barely more than a murmur. "Why are you running?" The words sent a jolt of terror through me. I bolted, sprinting toward the front door, desperate to escape. But as I reached for the handle, my hand froze. It wasn't me, something held me back, an invisible force that stopped my fingers from wrapping around the cold metal. I looked down, and there it was, the shadow, stretching up from the floor, wrapping itself around my arm like a dark, slithering snake. It was pulling me back, away from the door, away from freedom. "Let me go!" I screamed, yanking my arm with all my strength. But it was no use. The shadow was too strong. It tightened its grip, cold and unyielding, as the room around me seemed to grow darker, the walls closing in. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it released me. I stumbled backward, crashing into the wall, gasping for air. My arm was free, but the shadow remained on the floor, swirling and shifting like a pool of ink. It no longer resembled my own silhouette. It had changed, becoming something else, something otherworldly. For a moment, I just stood there, paralyzed by fear. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, something to make sense of what I had just experienced. But there was none. This wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a dream. It was real. And it was happening to me. The shadow moved again, slowly rising from the floor, its form becoming more distinct. It was no longer flat, no longer confined to the ground. It had depth now, a three-dimensional shape that seemed to shift and writhe as it stood before me. I stared at it, unable to move, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of the house, but my body wouldn't listen. I was rooted to the spot, frozen in place by a terror so deep, so primal, that it consumed every rational thought. The shadow didn't move any closer, but its presence filled the room, overwhelming, suffocating. It loomed over me, silent and still, as if waiting for something. My throat was dry, my pulse pounding in my ears, but somehow I found the strength to speak. "What do you want from me?" The words came out in a hoarse whisper, barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. The shadow remained motionless for a moment, its form undulating slightly in the dim light. And then, without warning, it began to retreat, slowly sinking back into the floor, blending once again with my own shadow. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my body trembling, my mind reeling from the impossible reality I had just witnessed. And then, as quickly as it had come, the shadow was gone. I collapsed to the floor, my legs no longer able to support me. The room was still, the air heavy with an unnatural silence. For a long time, I just sat there, too stunned to move, my mind racing in circles. What had just happened? What was that thing? And why did it feel like it was waiting for me? I glanced at the window, half expecting to see the shadow lurking outside, watching me. But there was nothing there. Only darkness, stretching out beyond the glass, cold and indifferent. My body ached from the tension, every muscle tight and knotted with fear. I had never felt so vulnerable, so utterly powerless. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real. And it wasn't going away. I knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Days passed, but the fear never left me. It lingered like a heavy fog, creeping into every corner of my life. I tried to go about my routine, forcing myself to work, pretending that everything was normal. But it wasn't. I could feel it watching me, that shadow, that presence. Even while I was surrounded by people, I felt its eyes on me, always there, lurking just out of sight. At night, things were worse. Every creak of the house made my heart race. I started sleeping with the lights on, but even the brightest bulbs couldn't chase away the darkness that seemed to pool in the corners of my room. The shadow never appeared fully again, but I could feel it. Every time I closed my eyes, I sensed it hovering just beyond my vision, waiting. I stopped looking at my reflection. Every mirror, every window became a source of anxiety. I couldn't trust what I might see there. I knew if I looked too long, I'd catch a glimpse of something that didn't belong, something that wasn't me. I couldn't talk to anyone about it. How could I explain what was happening without sounding insane? No one else saw it. No one else felt it. And so, I suffered in silence, trapped in my own private nightmare. But the shadow wasn't content with just watching. It was growing stronger, bolder. It started small, strange noises in the house, objects moved slightly from where I'd left them, lights flickering for no reason. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but soon the changes became impossible to ignore. One evening, after another long day of trying to act normal, I came home to find my living room in disarray. The bookshelves were empty, every single book scattered across the floor. The chairs were overturned, and a picture frame lay shattered near the wall. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. No one had been in the house. The door was locked when I arrived. And yet, it looked like a storm had torn through the room. But it wasn't the mess that terrified me the most. It was the shadow. It stood in the center of the room, tall and menacing, its form more distinct than ever before. It no longer looked like my shadow at all. It was darker, more solid, its edges sharp and defined. And this time, it wasn't just standing there. It was moving. Slowly, deliberately, it reached out toward the books on the floor, its fingers, if you could call them that, brushing against the pages as though it were searching for something. I backed away, my pulse racing, my breath shallow and rapid. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was trapped, paralyzed by fear. The shadow seemed to sense me watching. It paused for a moment, its head, or what passed for one, turning slightly in my direction. Then, in one fluid motion, it straightened up and began to advance. I stumbled backward, my hand fumbling for the light switch. The room flooded with light, and for a brief second, I thought the shadow would disappear. But it didn't. It remained, dark and solid, even in the bright glare of the overhead lights. Panic surged through me as the shadow came closer, its form shifting and rippling like a pool of ink. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to cooperate. All I could do was stare, helpless, as it loomed over me. And then, without warning, it stopped. It stood there, towering above me, its presence oppressive and suffocating. I could feel the cold radiating off of it, seeping into my skin, my bones. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I waited, expecting it to strike, to consume me. But instead, it whispered again. This time, the words were clear, chilling me to the core. You belong to me. I staggered back, finally finding the strength to move. I bolted from the room, sprinting toward the front door. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I threw the door open and ran outside, into the cool night air. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, gasping for breath, my chest heaving. I collapsed onto the curb, my mind racing. What was happening? Why was this thing tormenting me? What did it want? I looked back at my house, half expecting to see the shadow standing in the doorway, watching me. but the house was dark and still, as though nothing had happened. I wanted to keep running, to get as far away from that place as possible, but where could I go? It was my home, and yet I no longer felt safe there. That night, I slept in my car, parked a few blocks away. The streets were quiet, empty, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, I managed to fall into an uneasy sleep. But the rest didn't last long. I woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the sensation of being watched stronger than ever. My eyes snapped open, and there, standing just outside my car window, was the shadow. It had followed me. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, its form blending with the night, watching, waiting. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared back at it, too afraid to move, too afraid to breathe. The street was empty, no sign of life anywhere. Just me, and it. I thought about driving away, but something told me it wouldn't matter. Wherever I went, it would follow. I was no longer safe, not here, not anywhere. The shadow had made sure of that. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing to calm the rising tide of panic. But it was no use. The shadow was always there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for me to let my guard down. The words echoed in my mind, a constant, haunting reminder, you belong to me. The next morning, I drove home, bleary-eyed and exhausted. My mind was in a haze, the events of the previous night playing over and over like a broken record. It wasn't just the lack of sleep, it was the crushing weight of fear that had settled deep in my bones. When I pulled into the driveway, the house stood there, silent and still, as though nothing unusual had ever happened. I sat in the car for a long moment, staring at the front door, too afraid to go inside. What if the shadow was waiting for me? What if it never left? But I had no choice. I couldn't stay in my car forever. With a deep breath, I forced myself out and walked toward the house. Every step felt like walking into a trap, my nerves on edge, my senses heightened. The morning air was cool, and the sun shone brightly, but it offered no comfort. It felt wrong, like the calm before a storm. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the house was eerily quiet. I stood there in the entryway, listening, half expecting to hear the faint whisper of my name again. But there was nothing. Just the empty silence, heavy and oppressive. The living room was exactly as I had left it, books scattered on the floor, chairs overturned, the shattered picture framed by the wall. I wasn't imagining it. Something had been here. I knelt down and started to clean up the mess, trying to distract myself, to force some normalcy back into my life. As I picked up the books and placed them back on the shelves, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of paper sent a jolt of panic through me. It was still here. I could feel it. But it was hiding, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Hours passed, and the house remained quiet. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was over, that whatever had haunted me last night was gone. But deep down, I knew better. This shadow wasn't done with me. Not yet. That evening, I sat in the living room, the television on but barely registering what was on the screen. I was just trying to stay awake, to keep myself from slipping into sleep where I might be vulnerable. My body ached with exhaustion, my eyes heavy, but the fear kept me awake. Then, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows in the room grew longer, I felt it again. That creeping sense of dread, the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I glanced around, searching the dim corners of the room. There it was. In the far corner, where the light barely reached, the shadow had returned. It stood still, its form blending with the darkness, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't just a trick of the light, it was there, watching me. I wanted to scream, to run, but something held me in place. My body refused to move, my muscles locked with fear. I could only stare, wide-eyed, as the shadow slowly began to shift. It moved along the wall, creeping toward me, its dark form slithering across the floor like liquid night. My breath caught in my throat as it drew closer, inch by inch, until it was right in front of me. I could feel the cold radiating off of it, that same bone-chilling cold that I had felt before. And then, without warning, it spoke again. This time, the voice was louder, more insistent. "You can't escape me." I gasped, my heart pounding in my chest. The words echoed in my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts. I wanted to run, but I knew there was no point. Wherever I went, it would follow. It was a part of me now, inescapable. The shadow stood over me, its form towering, menacing. I could feel its presence pressing down on me, suffocating, as though it was draining the very life from me. My limbs felt heavy, my breath shallow. I was drowning in darkness, consumed by it. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the shadow retreated. It pulled back, melting into the wall, disappearing into the corners of the room. The weight lifted from my chest, and I gasped for air, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. I sat there, shaking, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no sense to it. No logic, no reason. The shadow was real, and it was hunting me. The days that followed were a blur. I stopped going to work, stopped talking to friends. My life became consumed by the shadow. It was always there, lurking, waiting. Sometimes it would appear for just a few moments, other times it would linger for hours, watching me from the dark corners of my house. I tried to stay awake, but the exhaustion was unbearable. I would fall asleep, only to wake up in a cold sweat, the sensation of being watched stronger than ever. The shadow invaded my dreams, turning them into nightmares that I couldn't escape. I was losing control. One night, after another restless evening of pacing the house, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. I had to get out of the house, away from the shadow, before it drove me mad. I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and ran to the car. The streets were empty, quiet, as I sped away, not knowing where I was going, just knowing that I needed to be anywhere but here. But as I drove, I realized something chilling. No matter how far I went, no matter how fast I drove, the shadow would follow me. It was a part of me now, tied to me in some way that I didn't understand. And then I saw it. In the rearview mirror, there it was, sitting in the back seat. The shadow, its dark form barely visible in the dim light of the dashboard. It had followed me. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop in the middle of the empty road. My heart raced as I whipped around to look at the back seat, but it was empty. The shadow was gone. But I knew it was still there, somewhere, waiting. I couldn't escape it. No matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, the shadow would always be with me. I had driven for hours, but the road felt endless. There was no destination in mind, no place that felt safe. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the shadow again, lurking just behind me. But it was never there. At least, not in a way that I could see. The radio crackled with static, and I shut it off, leaving only the sound of my tires on the pavement and my own ragged breathing to fill the silence. The night outside was oppressive, the darkness so thick it seemed to swallow the world beyond the beam of my headlights. I pulled into a small roadside motel around dawn. It was the kind of place you didn't really want to stay at, but I was desperate, my body too exhausted to keep going. The clerk at the front desk barely looked at me as I checked in, and I was grateful. I didn't want anyone to see the fear in my eyes, the madness that I knew must be written all over my face. The room was small and musty, with flickering lights and worn-out furniture. But it was quiet, and for a moment, I thought I might be safe. I threw my bag on the bed and locked the door behind me, as though that simple act could keep the shadow at bay. But deep down, I knew better. I couldn't run from it. The shadow was a part of me now, tethered to me in a way I couldn't understand. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the wall, my mind racing. What did it want from me? Why wouldn't it leave me alone? There was no rational explanation, no way to comprehend what was happening. All I knew was that it was getting worse. The shadow was growing stronger, more aggressive. It wasn't content with just watching anymore, it wanted something from me. The whispering had become constant, like a background noise I couldn't shut out. It echoed in my head, taunting me, telling me I belonged to it, that I couldn't escape. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but the words were inside me, deeper than sound. You can't hide. I jumped to my feet, my pulse racing, scanning the room for any sign of movement. But the shadow wasn't there. Not yet. Still, I could feel it, lurking just outside the range of my vision, waiting for the moment to strike. I paced the small room, trying to think, trying to come up with a plan. I couldn't stay here forever. Sooner or later, I'd have to face it. But how do you fight something that isn't even real? Something that defies logic, that slips between the cracks of reality like smoke? My thoughts spiraled into chaos, my mind fraying at the edges. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating. I felt like I was drowning in it, sinking deeper and deeper into a pit of despair. And then I remembered something. It was just a fleeting memory, something that had happened weeks ago, before all of this started. I had gone to an antique store, looking for a gift. I had wandered through the dusty aisles, picking up trinkets and curios, not really sure what I was looking for. And then I had seen it, a mirror, old and cracked, with an ornate frame that looked out of place in the cluttered shop. I had been drawn to it, inexplicably. There was something about it that had caught my attention, something that felt wrong. But I had bought it anyway. I didn't know why. I just had. That mirror now hung in my living room, untouched since the day I brought it home. Could it be connected? Was that where the shadow had come from? The thought chilled me to the core. If the mirror was the source, then I had invited this thing into my life. I had brought it into my home. Suddenly, the pieces started to fall into place. The strange occurrences, the feeling of being watched, the way the shadows seemed to grow stronger over time. It had all started after I brought that mirror home. And now, the shadow had attached itself to me, feeding off my fear, growing more real with each passing day. I had to destroy it. I didn't know if it would work, but it was the only idea I had. If the mirror was the source, then maybe breaking it would end this nightmare once and for all. But that meant going back to the house. The thought of returning filled me with dread. The shadow would be waiting for me. I knew that much. But what choice did I have? I couldn't live like this, constantly running, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the shadow to claim me. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door. The sun had risen by now, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I hesitated for a moment, the familiar fear creeping back in, but I forced myself to keep moving. The drive back felt surreal, like moving through a dream. The road stretched out endlessly before me, the landscape blurring as exhaustion and fear gnawed at the edges of my consciousness. I wasn't sure how much time had passed when I finally pulled up to my house. It looked exactly as I had left it, quiet, unassuming. But I knew what was inside. I parked the car and sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to gather the courage to go in. My heart raced, my hands trembling. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't sure if I'd ever be ready. But there was no turning back now. I stepped out of the car and walked up to the front door, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The key turned easily in the lock, and the door swung open with a soft creak. The house was dark, silent, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. I didn't bother turning on the lights. Somehow, I knew it wouldn't make a difference. The mirror hung on the wall, just as I had left it. Its surface was cloudy, the cracks spidering out from the center like a web. I walked toward it, my footsteps echoing in the quiet house. As I reached the mirror, I hesitated. My reflection stared back at me, distorted by the cracks. But there was something else there, too. A shadow, just behind me, looming large and menacing. It was watching me. I gripped the edge of the mirror, my fingers digging into the cold, ornate frame. My heart pounded in my chest, my body trembling with fear. I raised my hand, ready to smash the glass, to end this once and for all. But just as I was about to strike, the shadow moved. It surged forward, wrapping around me like a cloak, its presence overwhelming. I gasped, the air stolen from my lungs as the darkness consumed me. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe. I was drowning in it, lost in the void. And then, I heard the whisper again, louder this time, more forceful. You can't destroy me. I am you. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and suddenly, everything became clear. The shadow wasn't just some external force haunting me. It was a part of me, a reflection of my own fears, my own darkness. I had been running from myself. The realization hit me harder than anything else. The shadow wasn't some external force haunting my life. It wasn't a ghost, a curse, or a demon. It was me, or at least, a part of me. All this time, I had been running from my own fear, from the darkness I had let fester deep inside. But knowing this didn't make it any easier to face. The shadow still loomed over me, suffocating in its intensity. I could feel it pressing in, filling the room, the house, my mind. It was like a mirror reflecting every fear, every doubt, every dark thought I had ever had. The cracks in the mirror seemed to widen, distorting my reflection even further. My own face stared back at me, but twisted, warped by the fractures. And behind me, the shadow stood tall, no longer just a dark shape in the corner, but a tangible presence. I am you, the whisper repeated, this time coming from the very core of my being. It wasn't just in my head, it felt like it was coming from my soul. I wanted to deny it, to fight it, but deep down, I knew it was the truth. The fear, the anxiety, the darkness that had been following me was my own. I had carried it with me for years, letting it grow and twist until it took on a life of its own. But now, it was time to stop running. I stepped closer to the mirror, my reflection growing clearer, though still fractured. I could feel the shadow hovering just behind me, its cold presence sending shivers down my spine. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay calm. I raised my hand, pressing it against the cracked surface of the mirror. The glass was cold, almost icy, but I didn't pull away. I had to face it, myself, no matter how terrifying it was. "You can't control me anymore," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "You're a part of me, but you don't define me." The shadow didn't move, but I could feel its presence shifting. It was still there, still powerful, but somehow less. As though acknowledging it, facing it head on, and weakened its grip on me. I took a deep breath and, with all the strength I had left, pushed against the mirror. The glass shattered. It exploded outward in a burst of light and sound, the pieces falling like rain, scattering across the floor. For a moment, the room was filled with a deafening silence, and I stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the broken shards of glass at my feet. The shadow was gone. I could feel the absence immediately. The cold, oppressive weight that had been pressing down on me for weeks had lifted. The house was still dark, but it no longer felt haunted, no longer felt like something was lurking just beyond my vision. I was alone. Finally, truly alone. I sank to the floor, my body trembling from the adrenaline, the fear, the exhaustion. I had been fighting myself all along, battling a part of me that I didn't want to acknowledge, a part that I had buried deep inside. But now, I understood. The shadow was my fear, my guilt, my darkness, but it was also a part of what made me whole. For the first time in weeks, I felt free. The days that followed were a blur of quiet recovery. I stayed in the house, cleaning up the shattered glass, putting things back in order. The oppressive fear that had once gripped me was gone, replaced by a strange sense of peace. I didn't talk to anyone about what had happened. How could I? Who would believe that I had been haunted by a manifestation of my own fears, by a shadow that was as much a part of me as my reflection? No one, that's who. But I didn't need them to believe me. I knew the truth. I had faced the darkest part of myself and survived. But there was something else, too. Something that lingered at the edges of my mind, like a whisper just out of earshot. The shadow wasn't gone entirely. I could still feel it, deep down, waiting. It was quieter now, weaker, but it was still there. I understood now that it would never truly go away. It was a part of me, a part of everyone, in a way. We all have shadows, dark parts of ourselves that we try to ignore, to run from. But you can't outrun your own reflection. You can only face it, accept it, and learn to live with it. I had learned that the hard way. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the living room, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. A flicker of movement, a familiar shape. The shadow. It was faint, barely there, but it was watching me. Not in the menacing way it once had, but almost patiently. Waiting. I didn't feel fear this time. Instead, I stood there, staring at it for a long moment, acknowledging its presence. Then, I turned away, letting it fade into the background. The shadow was still there, but I wasn't afraid anymore. Weeks later, I decided to sell the house. It wasn't that I couldn't live there anymore, it was that I didn't need to. The chapter of my life that had unfolded within those walls was over. I had faced my fear, confronted my shadow, and come out the other side. As I packed up the last of my belongings, I found myself lingering over the broken mirror. I hadn't thrown it away, though I wasn't sure why. It was just a frame now, the glass shattered into 1,000 tiny fragments, each one reflecting a distorted version of the room around it. I hesitated for a moment, then picked up a shard, holding it up to the light. My reflection stared back at me, fractured and incomplete. But I smiled, because I understood now. We're all fractured in some way, all of us broken in places we can't always see. But that doesn't mean we're beyond repair. I dropped the shard back into the box and closed it. As I walked out of the house for the last time, I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The shadows in the room were long, stretching across the floor, but they didn't scare me anymore. I had learned to live with them. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. Obsession with the house. Have you ever felt a strange pull towards a place you've never been? A house, perhaps, with its peeling paint and cracked windows that beckons you to step inside as if it knows something about you that you don't? For my family, that house was an old Victorian on the outskirts of town, its silhouette looming against the twilight sky like a dark omen. It all began with a simple invitation. My parents, weary from the grind of daily life, decided we needed a getaway, and this house was available for rent at an unbelievable price. The listing mentioned its charming character and rich history, but as soon as we drove up the gravel path, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the brisk autumn air. I remember stepping out of the car, my sneakers crunching on the gravel, and gazing at the house with its dark wood and sagging roof. It looked like it had stories to tell, stories that didn't want to be heard. My younger sister, Lily, scampered up the creaking porch steps, her laughter echoing in the stillness, while my parents exchanged hopeful glances. They believed they found a quaint retreat. I sensed something else entirely. As we entered the house, a musty smell enveloped us, mingling with the scent of old wood. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight filtering through the tattered curtains. I wandered into the living room, where an antique mirror hung over the fireplace. It was ornate, its gilded frame twisted with age, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of movement behind me in the glass, a shadow darting just out of view. I blinked and turned, but nothing was there. Just Lily, playing with a dusty toy, unaware of the prickling unease creeping up my spine. My parents settled into unpacking, each action imbued with a sense of normalcy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching us, sizing us up. I glanced around the room, taking in the faded wallpaper and the peculiar family portraits that lined the walls, strangers with hollow eyes, their expressions almost too serious for the playful setting. They seemed to whisper secrets, and I shivered involuntarily. That evening, as dusk fell, we gathered for dinner at the old dining table, its surface marred by countless meals long forgotten. My father spoke animatedly about our plans for the next day, hiking, visiting the nearby lake, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't help but notice the way the shadows lengthened, creeping closer with each flicker of the candlelight. The laughter from my parents felt hollow, echoing off the walls in a way that sent shivers down my spine. Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep, I lay in bed, the covers pulled tight against my chin. The room was dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the thin curtains, casting eerie patterns on the walls. I felt a presence in the room, something lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. I held my breath, straining to listen, but all I could hear was the soft creak of the house settling, the whispers of the past intertwining with my thoughts. Then came the first sign, an unexpected chill, like icy fingers trailing along my arm, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked around. The shadows seemed to thicken, swirling in the corners of the room. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a product of an overactive mind, but deep down, I knew something was off. Sleep finally took me, but it was a restless slumber filled with unsettling dreams. I dreamed of the house, of its dark corners and hidden spaces, of voices calling out to me, inviting me to explore. I woke to the sound of my name whispered on the wind, soft yet urgent. The air felt heavy, saturated with an unsettling energy, as if the house itself were alive, pulsing with secrets and desires. When dawn broke, it brought no relief. I stumbled into the kitchen, where my parents were already preparing breakfast. They seemed unaware of the tension that had wrapped around me during the night. "Did you sleep well?" my mother asked, her tone light, but I detected a hint of concern in her eyes. I shrugged, trying to brush off the unease that lingered in my chest. As the day wore on, we explored the house further. I couldn't help but notice the oddities, a door that led to a wall, a staircase that twisted upward into darkness. The more I investigated, the stronger the feeling grew that the house held more than just dust and memories. It felt like a trap, a labyrinth designed to ensnare us, drawing us deeper into its embrace. By the end of the day, I had shared my feelings with my parents, but they dismissed them as mere nerves. "It's just an old house," my father laughed, ruffling my hair. "You're imagining things." But I wasn't. I could feel it, a weight pressing down on me, a sense of dread that tightened around my throat. That night, as the wind howled outside, I lay wide awake, listening to the whispers in the dark. I thought of the mirror in the living room, the strange shadows, and the way the house seemed to breathe. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone, that something ancient and malevolent was awakening, ready to claim us as its own. The next morning, the sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the house, but it felt like a deceptive calm. As we sat around the breakfast table, the air was thick with an unspoken tension. My parents chatted cheerfully, planning our day, but I could hardly focus on their words. My mind was consumed with the shadows that had crept into my dreams, the whispers that lingered like an echo in my ears. Obsession with the house. Have you ever felt a strange pull towards a place you've never been? A house, perhaps, with its peeling paint and cracked windows, that beckons you to step inside, as if it knows something about you that you don't? For my family, that house was an old Victorian on the outskirts of town, its silhouette looming against the twilight sky like a dark omen. It all began with a simple invitation. My parents, weary from the grind of daily life, decided we needed a getaway, and this house was available for rent at an unbelievable price. The listing mentioned its charming character and rich history, but as soon as we drove up the gravel path, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the brisk autumn air. I remember stepping out of the car, my sneakers crunching on the gravel, and gazing at the house with its dark wood and sagging roof. It looked like it had stories to tell, stories that didn't want to be heard. My younger sister, Lily, scampered up the creaking porch steps, her laughter echoing in the stillness, while my parents exchanged hopeful glances. They believed they found a quaint retreat. I sensed something else entirely. As we entered the house, a musty smell enveloped us, mingling with the scent of old wood. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight filtering through the tattered curtains. I wandered into the living room, where an antique mirror hung over the fireplace. It was ornate, its gilded frame twisted with age, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of movement behind me in the glass, a shadow darting just out of view. I blinked and turned, but nothing was there. Just Lily, playing with a dusty toy, unaware of the prickling unease creeping up my spine. My parents settled into unpacking, each action imbued with a sense of normalcy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching us, sizing us up. I glanced around the room, taking in the faded wallpaper and the peculiar family portraits that lined the walls, strangers with hollow eyes, their expressions almost too serious for the playful setting. They seemed to whisper secrets, and I shivered involuntarily. That evening, as dusk fell, we gathered for dinner at the old dining table, its surface marred by countless meals long forgotten. My father spoke animatedly about our plans for the next day, hiking, visiting the nearby lake, but my mind was elsewhere. I couldn't help but notice the way the shadows lengthened, creeping closer with each flicker of the candlelight. The laughter from my parents felt hollow, echoing off the walls in a way that sent shivers down my spine. Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep, I lay in bed, the covers pulled tight against my chin. The room was dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the thin curtains, casting eerie patterns on the walls. I felt a presence in the room, something lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. I held my breath, straining to listen, but all I could hear was the soft creak of the house settling, the whispers of the past intertwining with my thoughts. Then came the first sign, an unexpected chill, like icy fingers trailing along my arm, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked around. The shadows seemed to thicken, swirling in the corners of the room. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a product of an overactive mind, but deep down, I knew something was off. Sleep finally took me, but it was a restless slumber filled with unsettling dreams. I dreamed of the house, of its dark corners and hidden spaces, of voices calling out to me, inviting me to explore. I woke to the sound of my name whispered on the wind, soft yet urgent. The air felt heavy, saturated with an unsettling energy, as if the house itself were alive, pulsing with secrets and desires. When dawn broke, it brought no relief. I stumbled into the kitchen, where my parents were already preparing breakfast. They seemed unaware of the tension that had wrapped around me during the night. "Did you sleep well?" my mother asked, her tone light, but I detected a hint of concern in her eyes. I shrugged, trying to brush off the unease that lingered in my chest. As the day wore on, we explored the house further. I couldn't help but notice the oddities, a door that led to a wall, a staircase that twisted upward into darkness. The more I investigated, the stronger the feeling grew that the house held more than just dust and memories. It felt like a trap, a labyrinth designed to ensnare us, drawing us deeper into its embrace. By the end of the day, I had shared my feelings with my parents, but they dismissed them as mere nerves. "It's just an old house," my father laughed, ruffling my hair. "You're imagining things." But I wasn't. I could feel it, a weight pressing down on me, a sense of dread that tightened around my throat. That night, as the wind howled outside, I lay wide awake, listening to the whispers in the dark. I thought of the mirror in the living room, the strange shadows, and the way the house seemed to breathe. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone, that something ancient and malevolent was awakening, ready to claim us as its own. The next morning, the sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the house, but it felt like a deceptive calm. As we sat around the breakfast table, the air was thick with an unspoken tension. My parents chatted cheerfully, planning our day, but I could hardly focus on their words. My mind was consumed with the shadows that had crept into my dreams, the whispers that lingered like an echo in my ears. As we moved through the attic, I tried to shake off the weight of the journal's words. But the unease persisted, wrapping around me like a vice. I felt the house shifting, its energy swirling as if it were responding to our presence. That evening, as we gathered for dinner, the atmosphere felt charged. My parents were engaged in conversation, but I could sense something lurking beneath the surface, a tension that crackled like electricity. As we ate, the lights flickered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw the outline of a figure in the hallway, just out of view. "Did you see that?" I blurted out, my voice barely above a whisper. "What, honey?" my mother asked, her brow furrowing. The light, there was something in the hallway. I felt the heat of their gazes upon me, a mix of concern and disbelief. "Just the old wiring," my father replied, chuckling softly. "Nothing to worry about." but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, and the whispers grew louder, echoing in my mind. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of the house pressed down on me, and I realized that the invitation we had accepted came at a price, one that we might not be able to pay. The next day dawned with an uneasy stillness that blanketed the house. I awoke with the remnants of last night's nightmares clinging to me like cobwebs. I hesitated to leave the safety of my room, but a sense of urgency pushed me out into the hallway. I had to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows. After breakfast, I gathered my courage and suggested we explore the basement. My parents exchanged glances, and I could sense their hesitation, but eventually they agreed. As we descended the creaky wooden stairs, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. The basement was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting elongated shadows that danced along the walls. Old furniture, forgotten toys, and stacks of boxes lay scattered about, remnants of lives once lived. I scanned the room, my heart racing with anticipation and dread. "Let's look in those boxes," I said, pointing toward a pile in the corner. My parents nodded, and we began to sift through the dusty containers, pulling out items that seemed to carry the weight of memories. But the more we unearthed, the more I felt a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The shadows grew longer, stretching towards us, as if eager to envelop us in darkness. Lily giggled, oblivious to the growing tension. "Look at this old doll," she exclaimed, holding up a tattered porcelain figure with cracked features. Its painted eyes seemed to follow us, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "Can we take it home?" she asked. "Maybe not," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "It looks old." My parents chuckled, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was more than just a relic of the past. As we continued to rummage through the boxes, I stumbled upon an old trunk tucked away in the farthest corner. It was locked, but the latch looked worn, as if it had been opened many times before. My heart raced as I considered the possibility of what it might contain. With a quick glance at my parents, I decided to pry it open. Using a nearby screwdriver, I worked at the latch until it finally gave way. The trunk creaked open, revealing a collection of letters tied with a faded ribbon. My fingers trembled as I pulled them out, the paper yellowed and fragile. I began to read aloud, and as I did, a chill settled over the room. The letters were correspondence between Margaret and a man named Thomas, her husband. They spoke of love and hope, but also of fear, the same fear I had read about in her journal. The tone shifted drastically in the later letters, filled with desperation and unease. "The house watches us. I can feel its presence, lurking in the shadows. I fear for our children." My voice faltered as I read, and I looked up to find my parents pale, their expressions mirroring my own growing horror. "What does this mean?" my mother whispered, her hands trembling. Before I could respond, the light above us flickered violently, plunging us into darkness. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed Lily's hand tightly. "We need to get out of here," I shouted, and we bolted for the stairs. As we rushed up, I heard the unmistakable sound of laughter echoing in the basement, a chilling sound that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just laughter, it was mocking, as if the house itself was reveling in our fear. We reached the top of the stairs, but as I turned to shut the basement door, I caught a glimpse of something, a figure standing in the shadows, just beyond the edge of the light. "Did you see that?" I gasped, heart pounding. "See what?" my father asked, bewildered. "The figure. It was right there." I pointed, but the hallway was empty. Doubt crept in, twisting my insides. Had I imagined it? My parents exchanged worried glances, but before anyone could speak, Lily's cheerful voice broke the tension. "Look! I found this." She held up the doll she had discovered earlier, its face eerily serene against the chaos around us. "No, put that down," I exclaimed, but it was too late. As she clutched the doll, a sudden gust of wind rushed through the hallway, extinguishing the light. We were plunged into darkness, the oppressive silence shattered by the sound of whispering voices swirling around us like a tempest. "Get to the living room," my mother shouted, panic rising in her voice. We stumbled down the hall, but the house felt different now, its layout shifting, doors closing before we could reach them. I could feel the walls closing in, the whispers growing louder, echoing our fears and doubts. It was as if the house was feeding off our terror, drawing strength from our panic. We finally burst into the living room, panting and wide-eyed. The candlelight flickered, casting ominous shadows on the walls. My father slammed the door behind us, breathing heavily. "What the hell is happening?" he said, his voice edged with fear. "I don't know," I admitted, feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing down on me. "But the letters, they said the house is alive, that it feeds on fear." Lily held the doll closer, her expression innocent yet unnerving. "It likes me," she said softly, her voice tinged with something almost childlike, but there was an undercurrent that sent chills racing down my spine. "Put it down, Lily," I urged, but she only giggled, twirling the doll in her hands. I glanced at my parents, their faces etched with worry. This was spiraling out of control, and we needed to figure out how to escape the grip of this house before it was too late. As the shadows deepened around us, I realized we were running out of time. The house was no longer a simple retreat, it had transformed into a malevolent entity, intent on claiming us as part of its twisted narrative. I knew we had to confront whatever darkness lurked within its walls, or risk losing ourselves to it completely. Panic coursed through me like a wildfire as I stared at Lily, her grip on the doll tightening. The air in the living room felt charged, almost electric, as the shadows closed in around us. "Lily, please," I pleaded, trying to reach her through the fog of her laughter. "You need to let it go." She tilted her head, her eyes wide but unfocused, as if she were in a trance. "But it wants to play," she said, her voice eerily calm amidst the chaos. My parents exchanged glances, fear etched on their faces, and I could feel the house shifting, as if it were aware of our growing desperation. "We need to find a way to break whatever hold this place has over us," I said, my voice trembling with urgency. "There has to be something we can do." "Maybe the journal," my father suggested, his brow furrowed. "If we can find a way to reverse whatever is happening." Nodding, I turned back toward the hallway, but the shadows seemed to thicken, swirling and pulsing as if they were alive. The whispers grew louder, drowning out my thoughts. I could feel the house pressing down on us, trying to suffocate our resolve. We had to act quickly. "Stay close," I warned as we moved toward the basement door again. The oppressive energy wrapped around us, and I hesitated, fear clawing at my insides. But we needed to confront this head-on. We descended into the darkness once more, the light flickering ominously as we moved deeper into the basement. My heart pounded in my chest, each thud echoing like a warning. I could feel the weight of the house's gaze on us, its breath hot against the back of my neck. "Where's the journal?" I asked, scanning the boxes we had left in disarray. My mother and father joined me, each of us searching frantically, desperation fueling our movements. But as I dug through the piles, I felt the air shift, a sudden coldness sweeping through the room. "It's here somewhere," my mother muttered, pulling out another box, her hands shaking. "We can't give up." Just then, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. The shadows coalesced into a form, indistinct yet familiar. "Margaret," I whispered, recognizing the woman from the photographs in the house. Her expression was one of sorrow, her eyes pleading. "Leave," she mouthed, her voice lost in the chaos around us. I felt a tug in my chest, a desperate need to understand what she wanted from us. "No!" I shouted, stepping forward. "We can't leave you here. You need to help us." The figure flickered, then dissipated into the darkness, but I felt her presence lingering, the weight of her despair settling in the corners of the room. I turned back to my family, urgency flaring within me. We have to break this cycle. We need to find a way to free her and ourselves. "Look," my father shouted, pointing to a large trunk against the far wall. "That must be it." We rushed over, and together we pried it open. Inside lay a collection of items, more letters, photographs, and a small ornate box, intricately carved with symbols I didn't recognize. My fingers trembled as I lifted the box, the air around us growing heavier. "What do we do with it?" my mother asked, fear evident in her voice. "I think it's a key," I said, recalling the journal's entries. "Maybe it can unlock whatever binds this house to us." Suddenly, Lily's voice broke through the tension. "It wants to play," she exclaimed, holding the doll aloft. The shadows writhed, and the temperature plummeted. I could feel the air crackling with energy as if the house were preparing for a confrontation. "Lily, put it down," I yelled, stepping closer. But she only giggled, and the room trembled in response. Before I could react, the doll flew from her hands, soaring through the air as if propelled by unseen forces. It landed at my feet, and as I reached down to pick it up, a wave of cold washed over me. The box began to vibrate, the symbols glowing faintly as if responding to the doll's presence. "It's connected," I realized, panic surging through me. The doll, Margaret, the house. They're all tied together. I clutched the box tightly, feeling the energy pulsing through it. "We need to combine them," I shouted, desperately looking at my family. "We can reverse this." With trembling hands, I opened the box, revealing a small crystal inside, shimmering with an otherworldly light. "Hold on to the doll," I commanded, and we all gathered around it. The shadows loomed closer, hissing in agitation, as if they knew we were trying to break free. As I held the crystal and the doll together, a blinding light enveloped us. The whispers intensified, rising to a deafening crescendo, swirling around us like a storm. The house shook violently, and I felt a force pulling at me, trying to tear me away from the light. "Focus!" I yelled, my voice cutting through the chaos. "We can't let it take us." My parents gripped my arms, grounding me as we fought against the darkness. "Margaret, we're here for you," I shouted into the void, feeling her presence urging us on. "Help us break free." In that moment, the light flared brighter, illuminating the room as the shadows recoiled. The whispers turned to wails, echoing through the basement, and I felt a release, a sudden surge of energy that surged through me like electricity. With one final push, I felt the connection snap, and the doll shattered, sending shards of porcelain flying in every direction. The shadows shrieked, their forms dissipating into nothingness as the house trembled one last time. As the light faded, I found myself on the basement floor, gasping for breath. My parents lay beside me, their faces pale but alive. Lily was curled up, holding the remains of the doll, her expression serene. "It's over," I whispered, relief flooding through me. The weight of the house had lifted, the air feeling lighter, the oppressive energy gone. But as I looked around, I noticed something strange. The trunk was closed again, the letters inside seemingly untouched. It was as if the house had sealed away its memories, leaving us with only echoes of what had transpired. As we climbed the stairs, the sun broke through the clouds outside, illuminating the world with warmth and light. We stepped out of the house, and I could finally breathe, the weight of the darkness lifting from my shoulders. But as I turned to take one last look, I felt a chill run down my spine. The mirror in the living room caught my eye, and for just a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing behind me, a fleeting glimpse of Margaret, smiling sadly before fading into the glass. I turned away, knowing that while we had escaped the house, its memories would linger, haunting us forever. We walked away, the shadows of the past receding, but the knowledge that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. Ghost in the old school. Have you ever wondered what secrets lie hidden in the walls of an old school? The kind of secrets that make your heart race and your skin crawl? I certainly didn't think much of it until I found myself standing before the crumbling facade of Lincoln High, a place long abandoned yet steeped in history and whispering with the voices of the past. The evening sun cast an orange glow over the cracked pavement as I approached the entrance. I had heard the stories, tales of a ghost haunting the halls, a former student who met a tragic end. But I brushed it all off as urban legend, merely the embellishments of local kids seeking thrills. I was here for a different reason. My friends and I had decided to explore the old school, driven by curiosity and a desire for adventure. Little did I know, I was about to uncover far more than I bargained for. As we pushed through the heavy wooden doors, a chilling gust of wind greeted us. Dust motes danced in the fading light, swirling in the air like tiny ghosts. The smell of mildew and decay was palpable, wrapping around me like an unwelcome blanket. My heart thudded in my chest, not from fear, but from the thrill of the unknown. It's just an old building, I reassured myself. There's nothing to be scared of. We ventured deeper into the school, our footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The once vibrant walls were now covered in peeling paint, and lockers stood ajar, their contents long since removed. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath us. I felt an odd mix of nostalgia and dread, as if the very air was charged with the emotions of all the students who had passed through these halls. "Look at this," my friend Jake called, pointing to a classroom door that hung slightly open. We made our way over, peering inside. The classroom was littered with old desks, some overturned, others coated in a thick layer of dust. A chalkboard, smeared with faded writing, stood at the front, its last lesson forgotten. I stepped inside, feeling a strange pull towards the room, as if it were beckoning me closer. "Creepy, right?" Mia whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. I nodded, my gaze fixed on an old globe sitting on a nearby shelf. It was cracked and yellowed, the continents barely recognizable. As I reached out to touch it, a sudden chill swept through the room, causing my skin to prickle. I froze, my hand hovering just above the globe. "Did you feel that?" I asked, glancing around at my friends, but they shrugged it off. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the sensation. "It's just a draft," I muttered, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. We continued our exploration, moving from room to room. Each space felt more oppressive than the last. The atmosphere thickened, wrapping around us like a fog. In one room, I spotted a tattered old yearbook lying on a desk, its pages yellowed with age. I flipped it open, my fingers trembling slightly. There, in the corner of the page, was a photo of a boy with a bright smile, one that sent a shiver down my spine. Something about his expression felt off, almost as if he were aware of something we were not. "Let's take a look at the gym," Jake suggested, eager to escape the heavy air of the classroom. I agreed, feeling the need to move away from the unease that was building in the pit of my stomach. As we walked through the corridors, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. It was as if the walls themselves were watching, listening to our every word. The gymnasium was vast, the wooden floorboards gleaming under the sparse light filtering through broken windows. Old banners hung limply from the rafters, remnants of a time when life thrived within these walls. As we stepped inside, the door creaked ominously behind us, slamming shut with a force that sent my heart racing. "Okay, that was weird," Mia said, her voice tinged with nervous laughter. "Let's just take a quick look and get out of here." But I hesitated, feeling an overwhelming sense of foreboding. It wasn't just the darkness that made me uneasy, it was the oppressive silence, the way the shadows seemed to deepen as we ventured further. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the storage room adjacent to the gym, startling us all. My heart raced, adrenaline coursing through my veins. "What was that?" I whispered, fear creeping into my voice. Jake shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant, but I could see the apprehension in his eyes. "Probably just a raccoon or something," he said, but I could tell he was trying to convince himself more than me. "Let's check it out." Before I could protest, he was already moving towards the door. I felt a pull of anxiety, but curiosity drove me forward. As we reached the door, it creaked open on its own, revealing a dark room filled with old gym equipment and forgotten trophies. The air was heavy with dust, and the silence seemed to thicken. I stepped inside, squinting into the gloom, but as I did, something shifted in the corner of my vision, a fleeting movement that sent a jolt of terror through me. "What was that?" I gasped, but my friends merely shrugged it off, stepping into the room as though it were an everyday occurrence. "It's just the shadows," Mia said, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, an instinctive warning echoing in my mind. In that moment, I knew we were not alone. The feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin. I could almost hear the echoes of laughter and voices that once filled these halls, but now they were replaced by an unsettling silence. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to take a step deeper into the storage room, the darkness seemingly closing in around us. "Let's split up and look for more weird stuff," Jake suggested, his enthusiasm palpable despite the growing tension in the air. I shot him a look, silently pleading for him to reconsider. There was something wrong about this place, and the thought of wandering alone in the shadows made my skin crawl. But my protests fell on deaf ears. Jake and Mia began to sift through old equipment, laughing nervously as they joked about the horrors they could conjure up. I hung back, leaning against a wall, trying to calm my racing heart. The air felt thick with unease, and I could swear I heard faint whispers, like distant echoes of conversations long forgotten. Suddenly, I noticed something in the far corner, a tall, dust-covered mirror, its surface mottled and cracked. The frame was ornate, a beautiful piece that seemed oddly out of place amidst the decay. Drawn by an inexplicable urge, I moved closer, my breath hitching as I peered into the glass. At first, I saw my reflection, but then it flickered. For a brief moment, the image shifted, and I saw a boy standing behind me, a blurry figure with hollow eyes, his mouth twisted in an expression I couldn't quite place. I blinked, and he was gone, leaving only my pale face staring back at me. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "Hey, you okay?" Mia asked, her voice pulling me from my stupor. I nodded, trying to shake off the chill that gripped me. "Just saw something in the mirror," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. "Probably just a trick of the light," she replied with a nervous laugh, but I could see the concern etched on her face. "Let's get out of here. This place gives me the creeps." We moved back towards the gym, but as we did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was trailing us, lurking just out of sight. The atmosphere was charged, crackling with tension. I could hear my friends chatting, but their voices felt distant, almost muffled, as though the walls were absorbing our sounds. Once back in the gym, I took a deep breath, attempting to steady my racing heart. "Let's check out the stage," Jake suggested, pointing to the raised platform at the far end of the room. "It'll be fun." I hesitated, but the thrill of exploration pushed me to follow. As we approached the stage, I felt a sense of foreboding wash over me, a heavy weight in the air. The floorboards creaked beneath our feet, and the shadows danced around us. It was as if the space itself was alive, shifting and swirling with a consciousness all its own. I glanced at the heavy curtains draped around the stage, their edges tattered and dusty, and felt an involuntary shiver run down my spine. Jake climbed up onto the stage, grinning. "Check this out," he exclaimed, raising his arms as if to welcome an invisible audience. I forced a smile, but inside, I was battling a rising tide of dread. "Come on, guys, let's get out of here," I said, my voice tinged with urgency. But my words fell on deaf ears. Mia and Jake were too caught up in the moment, laughing and goofing off. I took a step back, feeling increasingly isolated. I watched as Jake pretended to give a speech, and in that instant, the room grew colder. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement behind the curtains. My breath hitched. I turned to look, but there was nothing there, only the heavy fabric swaying slightly as if someone had just stepped back. "Mia, did you see that?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. She turned, frowning. "See what?" But before I could respond, the lights flickered ominously, plunging the gym into darkness for a heartbeat. A gasp escaped my lips, and when the lights returned, I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the stage, just outside the range of light. It was the boy from the mirror, his features now clearer, but still ghostly pale, his eyes hollow and searching. I stumbled backward, bumping into a row of dusty trophies that clattered to the floor, shattering the silence. "What's wrong?" Jake asked, turning to me, concern etched across his face. "Get down. Now!" I shouted, my voice rising with fear. But as I turned back to the stage, the boy was gone, leaving only a lingering chill in the air. "What are you talking about?" Mia asked, glancing nervously around the room. I shook my head, feeling dizzy with disbelief. "We need to leave. Now." Reluctantly, they followed me as I hurried toward the exit. The oppressive weight of the building felt like a living thing, pushing back against us. As we neared the door, I felt a rush of cold air sweep past me, carrying with it a faint whisper, words I couldn't quite make out, but they resonated deep within me, echoing my fears. The door creaked open, and we stepped out into the cool evening air, relief flooding over me. But as I turned back to the school, I caught sight of the figure in the window, standing motionless, watching us leave. My heart raced as I stumbled backward, the last remnants of light fading behind the old bricks. "Let's get out of here," I urged, my voice trembling. We hurried away from the building, the chill of the night air creeping in as we left the shadows behind. But as I glanced back one last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with us, lingering just beyond the edges of the light. We stumbled away from Lincoln High, my heart still pounding in my chest. The dark figure lingered in my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. "Did you guys see him?" I asked, urgency in my voice as we walked. "See who?" Mia replied, her brow furrowed in confusion. "I didn't see anything except for you freaking out." Jake shot me a glance, clearly uncertain but trying to remain skeptical. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, concern edging his tone. "You looked like you saw a ghost or something." "I think I did," I muttered, frustration mingling with fear. The events of the evening weighed heavily on me. I could still feel the cold of that boy's presence, the emptiness in his gaze. We decided to head to a nearby diner, a bright spot amidst the shadows, where the warmth of greasy food and bright neon lights would hopefully dispel the chill that clung to us. As we walked, I tried to push the eerie encounter from my mind, focusing instead on the laughter and chatter around us. Once inside the diner, I ordered a coffee, needing something strong to ground me. The diner was filled with the scent of fried food and the sound of clattering dishes, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the school. As we sat in a booth, I could feel my friend's eyes on me, their concern palpable. "Maybe you just imagined it," Mia suggested gently. "It's easy to get spooked in a place like that." But her voice lacked the conviction I needed to believe it myself. "Yeah," Jake added, "it's just an old building. Probably just your mind playing tricks on you." I nodded, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. The thought of returning to Lincoln High sent shivers down my spine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to understand what was happening. What had that boy wanted? Why had I seen him? As we ate, the atmosphere began to shift, a creeping unease settling in my gut. Just then, the door swung open, and a gust of cold air swept through the diner. I looked up, half expecting to see the boy from the school, but instead, it was an old man, withered and weary, who shuffled in. He took a seat at the counter, glancing around the diner with weary eyes. Something about him caught my attention, and I couldn't help but stare. The waitress approached him, but he waved her off, lost in thought. After a moment, he turned slightly, and our eyes met. I felt a jolt of recognition. "You've been to Lincoln High, haven't you?" I blurted out before I could stop myself. The old man looked at me, a deep sadness clouding his gaze. "It was a long time ago," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "You shouldn't be going there." "Why not?" I pressed, feeling an urgency to understand. "What happened?" He hesitated, glancing around as if weighing his words. "That place holds memories, memories best left buried. There's a reason it's abandoned. You can't let it in." A chill ran through me, and I leaned closer. "What do you mean?" "I saw something, a boy. He was in the mirror." The old man's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "You saw him? You have to be careful. He's not just a ghost, he's trapped, and he wants out." Before I could respond, he turned away, lost in his thoughts again. The diner felt suddenly stifling, the warmth replaced by an oppressive weight. My heart raced as I glanced at Mia and Jake, who were equally bewildered. Reluctantly, they followed me as I hurried toward the exit. The oppressive weight of the building felt like a living thing, pushing back against us. As we neared the door, I felt a rush of cold air sweep past me, carrying with it a faint whisper, words I couldn't quite make out, but they resonated deep within me, echoing my fears. The door creaked open, and we stepped out into the cool evening air, relief flooding over me. But as I turned back to the school, I caught sight of the figure in the window, standing motionless, watching us leave. My heart raced as I stumbled backward, the last remnants of light fading behind the old bricks. "Let's get out of here," I urged, my voice trembling. We hurried away from the building, the chill of the night air creeping in as we left the shadows behind. But as I glanced back one last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with us, lingering just beyond the edges of the light. We stumbled away from Lincoln High, my heart still pounding in my chest. The dark figure lingered in my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. "Did you guys see him?" I asked, urgency in my voice as we walked. "See who?" Mia replied, her brow furrowed in confusion. "I didn't see anything except for you freaking out." Jake shot me a glance, clearly uncertain but trying to remain skeptical. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, concern edging his tone. "You looked like you saw a ghost or something." "I think I did," I muttered, frustration mingling with fear. The events of the evening weighed heavily on me. I could still feel the cold of that boy's presence, the emptiness in his gaze. We decided to head to a nearby diner, a bright spot amidst the shadows, where the warmth of greasy food and bright neon lights would hopefully dispel the chill that clung to us. As we walked, I tried to push the eerie encounter from my mind, focusing instead on the laughter and chatter around us. Once inside the diner, I ordered a coffee, needing something strong to ground me. The diner was filled with the scent of fried food and the sound of clattering dishes, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence of the school. As we sat in a booth, I could feel my friends' eyes on me, their concern palpable. "Maybe you just imagined it," Mia suggested gently. "It's easy to get spooked in a place like that." But her voice lacked the conviction I needed to believe it myself. "Yeah," Jake added, "it's just an old building. Probably just your mind playing tricks on you." I nodded, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. The thought of returning to Lincoln High sent shivers down my spine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to understand what was happening. What had that boy wanted? Why had I seen him? As we ate, the atmosphere began to shift, a creeping unease settling in my gut. Just then, the door swung open, and a gust of cold air swept through the diner. I looked up, half expecting to see the boy from the school, but instead, it was an old man, withered and weary, who shuffled in. He took a seat at the counter, glancing around the diner with weary eyes. Something about him caught my attention, and I couldn't help but stare. The waitress approached him, but he waved her off, lost in thought. After a moment, he turned slightly, and our eyes met. I felt a jolt of recognition. "You've been to Lincoln High, haven't you?" I blurted out before I could stop myself. The old man looked at me, a deep sadness clouding his gaze. "It was a long time ago," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "You shouldn't be going there." "Why not?" I pressed, feeling an urgency to understand. "What happened?" He hesitated, glancing around as if weighing his words. "That place holds memories, memories best left buried. There's a reason it's abandoned. You can't let it in." A chill ran through me, and I leaned closer. "What do you mean?" "I saw something, a boy. He was in the mirror." The old man's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "You saw him? You have to be careful. He's not just a ghost, he's trapped, and he wants out. Before I could respond, he turned away, lost in his thoughts again. The diner felt suddenly stifling, the warmth replaced by an oppressive weight. My heart raced as I glanced at Mia and Jake, who were equally bewildered. As he spoke, the air around us crackled with energy, the atmosphere thickening with emotion. I glanced at my friends, fear and determination mirrored in their expressions. "We have to help him," I said, my voice steadying. "Where do we find this hidden room?" Jake asked, gripping his flashlight tightly. The boy pointed towards a corridor that led deeper into the school, the shadows seeming to pulse around us. "Follow the sound of the bell. It will guide you." "Okay, let's go," I said, swallowing my fear. We turned and hurried down the dark hallway, our flashlights illuminating the peeling walls and faded lockers. The air felt charged, alive with possibility. As we walked, the sound of a distant bell began to toll, echoing through the corridor. Each chime resonated like a heartbeat, urging us forward. I glanced back to ensure the boy was following, but he had faded into the darkness, leaving only a lingering chill in the air. The hallway twisted and turned, each step feeling like an eternity. The bell grew louder, its tolling resonating in my chest, guiding us deeper into the heart of the school. We reached a door at the end of the hall, its surface worn and scratched, as if it had been untouched for years. "This has to be it," I said, my heart racing. I pushed the door open, and it creaked ominously, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Dust motes floated in the air, catching the light from our flashlights. In the center of the room stood a solitary desk, cluttered with old papers and photographs. I stepped closer, my breath hitching as I recognized a familiar face in one of the faded photos, the boy from the mirror, smiling brightly in a school uniform. His name was Samuel, I whispered, realization dawning upon me. I turned to my friends. He was a student here. But something happened. I sifted through the papers, piecing together fragments of his story. There were notes from teachers, articles about his disappearance, and a final, heartbreaking letter from his parents. The words blurred together, but the anguish in their tone was clear. "We miss you, Samuel. We will never stop looking for you." Tears filled my eyes as I realized the weight of what I was holding. Samuel had been forgotten, lost to time and tragedy. "We have to help him remember," I said, urgency rising in my voice. The bell tolled again, resonating through the room, and I felt a rush of energy, an overwhelming urge to set things right. "Samuel, can you hear me?" I called, feeling the air shift. "I'm here," his voice echoed, soft but strong. "We found your story. We're here to help you." The room pulsed with energy, and the shadows swirled around us. Samuel's figure appeared once more solid than before, his expression a mix of hope and sadness. "Thank you," he said, his voice steadying. "Now, you must free me. Tell us how." I urged, feeling the weight of his plea. "There is a key, hidden in the clock tower. It holds my essence. If you can retrieve it, I can finally be free." The clock tower. The distant sound of the bell made sense now. "Let's go," I said, determination flooding my veins. We hurried out of the room, following the sound of the tolling bell as it grew louder, echoing through the hallways. Each step brought us closer to our goal, and with it, the weight of Samuel's tragic story felt lighter. As we reached the grand staircase, I looked back once more, half expecting the shadows to swallow us whole. But Samuel's presence lingered, urging us onward. The stairs creaked under our weight as we climbed higher, the air growing colder with each step. We finally reached the door to the clock tower, the ornate brass handle glinting in the light of our flashlights. "Here it is," I said, pushing the door open with a deep breath. The room was filled with the scent of dust and old wood, the massive clock mechanism looming above us, its hands frozen in time. In the center of the room, beneath the clock face, I spotted a small, intricately designed box. My heart raced as I approached it, feeling the weight of destiny pressing down on me. "Is that it?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I breathed, reaching out to lift the box from its pedestal. As I touched it, a surge of energy coursed through me, and the room seemed to vibrate with power. Just then, the clock began to chime, the sound resonating deep within my chest. The air crackled with electricity, and I felt Samuel's presence surge around us. "Open it," he urged, his voice echoing in my mind. I fumbled with the clasp, my hands trembling as I opened the box. Inside lay a shimmering key, glowing faintly. The moment I touched it, a vision flooded my mind, a glimpse of Samuel's life, his laughter, his friends, the day he disappeared. "Help me remember," I heard him plead. Suddenly, the walls of the clock tower began to tremble, and shadows twisted around us. "What's happening?" Jake shouted, panic rising in his voice. "We need to hurry," I yelled, clutching the key tightly. "We have to free him." Together, we raced back down the stairs, the sound of the clock chiming growing frantic behind us. The shadows surged, trying to pull us back, but with each step, I felt the weight of Samuel's sorrow lifting. As we burst into the gym, the air felt electric. "Samuel, we're here," I called out, raising the key high. The boy's figure appeared, a radiant glow surrounding him. "You found it." "Thank you." With a swift motion, I held the key toward him, feeling its energy pulse in my hand. "This is for you." The moment the key touched his essence, a blinding light enveloped the room. The shadows dissipated, and a wave of warmth washed over us. Samuel's form shimmered, and for the first time, a smile broke across his face, a look of pure relief and gratitude. "I'm free," he exclaimed, his voice ringing clear. "Thank you for remembering me." In that instant, the weight of sorrow lifted, and the air was filled with a sense of peace. The gym, once a place of shadows, was now illuminated with a warm glow. As the light faded, I felt a profound silence settle around us. The boy was gone, but his presence lingered, a whisper of hope in the stillness. "We did it," Mia breathed, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Yeah," I replied, a sense of accomplishment swelling within me. "We helped him find peace." As we stepped outside into the cool night air, I glanced back at the school, now just a silhouette against the moonlit sky. Lincoln High had been a place of fear and shadows, but we had uncovered a truth long forgotten, a story waiting to be told. And in that moment, I understood that sometimes the past can haunt us, but it can also guide us toward the light. With Samuel's memory finally honored, we walked away from the old building, the night sky stretching out before us, a reminder that even in darkness, there is always hope. The cursed house. Have you ever lived in a house that made you feel like you weren't alone, even when no one else was there? That's how it started for me. The feeling that I wasn't alone. My wife and I had just bought our first house, a beautiful, two-story building in a quiet neighborhood. It had everything we had ever wanted, a large garden, a wraparound porch, and a price that seemed almost too good to be true. Looking back now, I realize it was. The day we moved in, the house felt cold. Not just a little chilly, but bone deep, even though it was the middle of summer. I didn't think much of it at the time, just brushed it off as something to do with the old heating system. But now, I know better. The first week was relatively uneventful. Sure, there were some strange noises, creaks and groans coming from the walls, but we chalked it up to an old house settling. My wife, Lily, loved the place. She spent hours decorating each room, hanging curtains, and picking out furniture. It was her dream home. But for me, something always felt off. It was on the 7th night that things began to change. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and echoed through the hallway just outside our bedroom. At first, I thought it was Lily, maybe heading to the bathroom, but when I reached over to her side of the bed, she was still there, sleeping soundly. I lay there, frozen, listening as the footsteps grew closer. My heart was racing, but I didn't move. Then, just as they reached our bedroom door, they stopped. Complete silence. For a long moment, I didn't breathe. I strained to hear anything at all. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no sound of the door opening, nothing. I told myself I was imagining it. I had to be. But the next morning, when I checked the hallway, I noticed something strange. The floorboards had been scratched. Deep, jagged marks, as if someone or something had dragged sharp nails across them. I tried to stay calm, to keep it to myself, but the more I ignored it, the worse it got. Lily didn't seem to notice. In fact, she seemed happier than ever, completely oblivious to the strange happenings in the house. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next incident happened about a week later. We were sitting in the living room, watching TV, when out of nowhere, the lights flickered. I thought it was just a power surge, but then the temperature dropped. The warmth of the room vanished, replaced by an icy chill that made my breath visible in the air. Lily looked at me, her face pale. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. I nodded, but before I could say anything, the lights flickered again and then went out completely. We were plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the pale glow of the moon through the window. And that's when I saw it. A figure, standing in the corner of the room. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, bony limbs and empty, hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could only sit there, paralyzed by fear, as the figure slowly tilted its head, as if curious. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The lights came back on, and the room returned to normal, but I knew what I had seen. Lily hadn't noticed the figure. She was too busy fumbling for her phone, trying to call the power company. I didn't tell her. I didn't want to scare her. But deep down, I knew that whatever was in the house, it wasn't going to leave us alone. Days turned into weeks, and the strange occurrences became more frequent. Doors would slam shut on their own. Objects would move when we weren't looking. And at night, I could hear the whispers, faint, unintelligible voices, just beyond the edge of my hearing. They always seemed to be coming from the basement. I avoided the basement at all costs. There was something about it that felt wrong, as if the very air down there was thick with malice. But one night, I couldn't avoid it any longer. Lily had been working late, and I was home alone. I was sitting in the kitchen, trying to distract myself with some paperwork, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from the basement. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but as the steps grew louder, more insistent, I knew I couldn't ignore it. Grabbing a flashlight, I made my way to the basement door. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, and for a moment, I considered turning back. But something compelled me to keep going. The basement was dark, the only light coming from the narrow beam of my flashlight. The air was damp, and the smell of mildew hung heavy. As I descended the stairs, the footsteps stopped. Complete silence. I scanned the room, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just old boxes and forgotten furniture covered in dust. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again, this time closer. The flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls, and that's when I saw it. The figure from the living room was standing at the bottom of the stairs, its hollow eyes fixed on me. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, as if the very air around it was thick with dread. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then, without warning, it lunged at me. I screamed and scrambled up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely lock it, but somehow I managed. I pressed my back against the door, listening for any sign that it had followed me, but there was nothing. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up, clutching a kitchen knife, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the figure never appeared again. Not that night, anyway. The next morning, I tried to tell Lily, but she didn't believe me. She thought I was just stressed from work, that I was imagining things. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew the truth. The house was cursed. In the days that followed, the tension in the house became unbearable. Every creak, every gust of wind through the windows felt like an omen. I could hardly sleep. When I did, my dreams were plagued by nightmares, visions of the figure with hollow eyes, watching me from the shadows. I could feel its presence, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. Lily, on the other hand, seemed unaffected. She was her usual cheerful self, going about her day as if nothing was wrong. It was maddening. How could she not feel it? How could she not see what was happening right in front of us? One evening, as we sat down for dinner, I finally brought it up. Lily, don't you think something's off about this place? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. She looked at me, confused. Off? What do you mean? I don't know. The sounds, the cold spots, the things that keep moving on their own, I said, struggling to find the right words. I've seen things, Lily. In the house. There's something here. Her face softened, and she reached across the table to take my hand. I know it's been hard, adjusting to a new place, but you're just stressed. This house is old, it's bound to make some noise. I shook my head. It's not just noise. I've seen something. In the basement. In the living room. There's something in this house, and it's not. I stopped mid-sentence, my heart skipping a beat. From the corner of my eye, I saw something move, just a flicker of a shadow across the hallway behind Lily. It was gone in an instant, but I knew what I had seen. Did you see that? I whispered, my voice barely audible. See what? Lily asked, turning to look over her shoulder. There was nothing there, of course. The hallway was empty, but I knew the figure was still watching us. It was always watching. I tried to convince her to leave, to stay with friends or rent a hotel until we could figure out what was happening, but she refused. She loved this house too much. She had put her heart into making it a home, and she wasn't about to abandon it because of a few bumps in the night. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't concentrate at work, couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure. It was always there, always waiting. I started avoiding the basement altogether. Even walking past the door sent chills down my spine. But one night, everything changed. It was late, probably around 2 in the morning. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, a loud crash from downstairs. My heart leaped into my throat as I sat up, straining to listen. There was another crash, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I shook Lily awake. "Did you hear that?" She groggily sat up, rubbing her eyes. "What's going on?" "I don't know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Something's downstairs." I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept out of the bedroom, Lily following close behind. As we descended the stairs, the air grew colder, almost suffocating. The living room was dark, the furniture casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. Suddenly, the sound came again, a loud, metallic scrape from the basement. I froze, my hand tightening around the flashlight. "We have to go down there," I whispered, though every part of me wanted to run the other way. Lily shook her head. "No, we don't. Let's just go back upstairs. We can call someone in the morning." But I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was happening in that basement. I slowly made my way to the door, the cold air seeping through the cracks. With trembling hands, I turned the knob and pulled the door open. The basement was pitch black, but I could hear something moving down there, slow, deliberate footsteps echoing off the walls. I shone the flashlight down the stairs, but it barely penetrated the darkness. I could see the faint outline of boxes and old furniture, but nothing else. Then, from the far corner of the room, I saw it. The figure stood there, motionless, its hollow eyes staring back at me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, like a weight on my chest. "Lily," I whispered, backing up the stairs. "We need to get out of here." But before I could take another step, the door slammed shut behind us, trapping us in the darkness. Lily screamed, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. I shone the flashlight around the room, my hands shaking so badly that the beam wobbled. The figure was gone. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, a low, guttural growl filled the air, reverberating through the walls. I turned, and there it was, closer this time, its twisted, skeletal form illuminated by the dim light of the flashlight. Its eyes, or what should have been eyes, were nothing but hollow, black voids. I backed up against the wall, my heart racing. "Lily, we have to go." But she wasn't listening. She was frozen, her eyes wide with terror, staring at the figure as it slowly advanced toward us. And then, in one swift motion, it lunged. I grabbed Lily's arm and yanked her out of the way just in time. The figure missed us by inches, its outstretched arms sweeping through the air where we had just been standing. We bolted for the stairs, but the door at the top remained shut, as if some unseen force was holding it closed. "Come on. Help me push," I shouted, my shoulders slamming into the wooden door. It barely moved. Lily joined me, both of us throwing our weight against it in desperation. Behind us, the growling grew louder, the air thick with dread. "It's not budging," she cried, her voice trembling with fear. I glanced back over my shoulder, and that's when I saw it. The figure was advancing again, its twisted form moving with unnatural speed. My heart raced as I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it directly at the figure. For a split second, it seemed to falter, its body flickering like a shadow in the wind. "Keep going," I shouted, my voice cracking. With one final push, the door burst open and we stumbled into the hallway. We slammed it shut behind us, the sound echoing through the house. For a moment, all was quiet. I could still hear my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Lily leaned against the wall, clutching her chest. What was that?" she whispered. I shook my head, my mind spinning. "I don't know. But we can't stay here. We need to leave." We grabbed whatever we could, phones, keys, shoes, and ran for the front door. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a moment to unlock it, but finally we were outside, standing on the front lawn in the cold night air. The house loomed behind us, dark and silent. "We can't go back in there," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Lily nodded, still catching her breath. "I don't understand. Why didn't I see it before? Why didn't I feel anything?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the house was wrong, deeply, terrifyingly wrong. But now we were outside, away from whatever was haunting us. Or so I thought. As we stood there, trying to process what had just happened, I noticed something strange. The air around us felt different, heavier, almost electric. I glanced around, and that's when I saw it. The shadows. They were moving. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I realized it wasn't. The shadows cast by the streetlights and the trees were shifting, creeping along the ground like dark tendrils. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no denying it. The shadows were alive. "Lily," I whispered, grabbing her arm. "Look." She followed my gaze, her eyes widening in horror. No, it can't be." But it was. The shadows were closing in on us, surrounding us from all sides. The figure from the basement had somehow followed us outside, and now it was using the darkness itself to trap us. "Run," I shouted, pulling Lily with me as we sprinted down the street. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of town. By the time we slowed down, both of us were gasping for breath, our legs burning with exhaustion. We collapsed onto a bench in the park, too terrified to speak. For a while, we just sat there, the night air cold against our skin. The town was quiet, eerily so. No cars passed, no people walked by. It was as if we were the only two souls left in the world. Finally, Lily broke the silence. "What are we going to do?" I shook my head, my mind still racing. "I don't know. We can't go back to the house, that's for sure. But where can we go? What if it follows us again?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. Every logical part of me said to leave, to get as far away from that cursed house as possible. But something told me that running wouldn't help. The figure, the shadows, they weren't bound to the house. They were bound to us. "We need to find out what this thing is," I said, finally. "There has to be a reason it's after us." Lily looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "But how? Who do we even talk to about something like this?" I thought for a moment, then an idea hit me. The realtor. She's the one who sold us the house. Maybe she knows something. Lily nodded, though she still looked uncertain. "Okay, but what if she doesn't?" "Then we'll figure something else out," I said, standing up. "But we need to try." The next morning, we drove to the real estate office. The building was small and unassuming, tucked away in a strip mall on the edge of town. As we walked inside, I felt a knot of anxiety form in my stomach. The receptionist greeted us with a warm smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" "We need to speak to the realtor who sold us our house," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, that would be Mrs. Hargrove. Let me see if she's available." A few minutes later, an older woman with graying hair and a kind smile appeared. "Hello. You must be the new owners of the Harris place. How are you settling in?" I hesitated, unsure of how to begin. "Actually, that's why we're here. We've been experiencing some strange things in the house." Her smile faltered slightly. "Strange? What kind of strange things?" I glanced at Lily before continuing. "We've seen things. Shadows, figures. And there's something in the basement. We don't know what it is, but it's dangerous." Mrs. Hargrove's expression grew more serious. "I see. Why don't you come into my office? We can talk privately." We followed Mrs. Hargrove into her office, a small room lined with filing cabinets and old photographs of houses. She gestured for us to sit, then closed the door behind her. The warm, welcoming demeanor she had earlier was now replaced by something colder, more guarded. She took a seat behind her desk and folded her hands. "Tell me exactly what you've experienced." I glanced at Lily again, unsure of how much to reveal. But there was no point in holding back now. It started with strange noises, footsteps, doors opening and closing on their own. Then we began seeing shadows, figures moving through the house. But it wasn't until we went down into the basement that things got really bad. "There's something down there." A figure, dark and twisted, like nothing I've ever seen. Mrs. Hargrove didn't flinch. Instead, she let out a slow sigh and leaned back in her chair, her eyes growing distant. "I had hoped this wouldn't happen again," she muttered under her breath. Lily and I exchanged a glance. "What do you mean, again?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. The realtor was silent for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. "The house you bought, the Harris place, it has a history. A very dark one." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What kind of history?" Mrs. Hargrove glanced out the window, her eyes distant. "Years ago, long before you ever heard of the place, there was a tragedy. The Harris family was well known in town, but they kept to themselves. One night, they disappeared. Just like that, vanished without a trace. Some people say they left town, but others believe they never left the house at all." Lily's face turned pale. "What do you mean?" The realtor's gaze returned to us, her expression grave. "There have been rumors for decades, stories of strange occurrences, sightings of shadowy figures. People who lived there after the Harrisas all reported the same things you've described. And more often than not, they didn't stay long." I felt my throat tighten. "So why didn't you tell us this before we bought the house?" Mrs. Hargrove let out a tired sigh. "It's not something that can be proven. I'm bound by law to disclose any known issues with the property, but no one could ever provide solid evidence of anything supernatural. And, well, you have to understand, this town has fallen on hard times. Selling a house like that isn't easy. Most buyers don't believe in ghosts, and those who do are usually willing to take the risk for the right price." I clenched my fists, anger bubbling up inside me. We're not talking about just strange noises or cold spots. Something in that house tried to kill us. Mrs. Hargrove's eyes softened with sympathy. I'm sorry. Truly, I am. But there's nothing I can do. The house is yours now. Lily leaned forward, her voice shaking. But there has to be something we can do to stop it. We can't live like this. The realtor hesitated, then stood up and walked to one of the filing cabinets. She rummaged through the drawers for a moment before pulling out an old, yellowed folder. There is one thing, but I can't guarantee it will help. She handed the folder to me, and I opened it carefully. Inside were newspaper clippings, old photographs, and handwritten notes, all relating to the Harris family and the strange events surrounding the house. One headline caught my eye: The Curse of the Harris House, Town's Oldest Mystery. I skimmed the article, my heart racing as I read about the disappearance of the Harris family and the subsequent reports of paranormal activity. But it was one of the notes that made my blood run cold. The house is a gateway, it read in shaky handwriting. A portal between this world and something else. The spirits are not the souls of the dead, they are something older, darker. And once they latch onto you, they won't stop until they've claimed what they want. What does this mean? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mrs. Hargrove sat back down, her face pale. There have been whispers for years that the house is cursed, that it was built on some kind of ancient burial ground or site of dark rituals. No one knows for sure. But the theory is that the house serves as a conduit, allowing whatever is trapped there to reach out into our world. Lily's eyes were wide with fear. So, what do we do? How do we stop it? The realtor hesitated again, then lowered her voice. There's an old man who lives on the outskirts of town. His name is Jacob Wells. He's, well, some would call him a mystic, others a crackpot. But if anyone knows how to deal with the kind of thing you're experiencing, it's him. I wasn't sure how I felt about relying on a man who might be considered a lunatic, but at this point, we were desperate. Where can we find him? Mrs. Hargrove scribbled down an address and handed it to me. He doesn't take visitors often, but if you tell him what's happening, he might help. Just be careful. Jacob is known for being unpredictable. We thanked her and left the office, the weight of the folder heavy in my hands. As we drove to the outskirts of town, neither of us spoke. The reality of what we were dealing with had begun to sink in, and fear gnawed at my insides. When we finally reached Jacob Wells' house, it was exactly what I had expected, a ramshackle old cabin in the woods, the kind of place you'd see in a horror movie. We parked the car and walked up to the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. I knocked twice, the sound echoing through the stillness of the forest. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, just as I was about to knock again, the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, his face hidden in shadow. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly. I swallowed hard. We need your help. We've been experiencing something in our house." Jacob stepped into the light, revealing a weathered face with piercing blue eyes. "The Harris house?" I nodded, my throat tight. "Yes." "How did you know?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured for us to come in. "You'd better come inside." As the ritual progressed, the temperature in the room dropped, and the air grew thick with an almost palpable sense of malevolence. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, and I could feel the presence of someone watching us from the darkness. Every breath felt heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. Suddenly, the candles flickered violently, and the air was filled with a low, guttural growl. The room seemed to close in on us, the walls warping and twisting as if the house was alive, reacting to our presence. "Now!" Jacob shouted, his voice barely audible over the rising storm of shadows. "Offer the sacrifice." With trembling hands, I held out the locket, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment the locket left my fingers and landed in the center of the circle, the atmosphere shifted. For a moment, everything was still, too still. Then, with a sudden, violent force, the room exploded in a blinding flash of light. The ground shook beneath us, and I felt as though the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. I heard Lily scream, but her voice was muffled, distant, as though it came from another world. The shadows, once merely creeping at the edges of the room, surged toward us, their shapes twisting and contorting into grotesque, unrecognizable forms. They circled around the locket, drawn to it as if it were a beacon of light in the overwhelming darkness. I could feel the weight of their gaze, their hunger, and something else, recognition. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the chaos stopped. The shadows withdrew, receding into the walls, the floors, disappearing as if they had never been there at all. The oppressive atmosphere that had filled the house lifted, leaving behind a strange, empty calm. I blinked, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The locket lay still in the center of the circle, untouched, as though nothing had transpired. The air was eerily quiet, the only sound my own ragged breathing. I looked at Jacob, who stood frozen, his face pale and drained of color. "Is it over?" I whispered, my voice shaking. He didn't answer right away, his eyes fixed on the locket, as if expecting something more to happen. "I don't know," he finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room, and I felt an icy chill crawl down my spine. Something wasn't right. The shadows were gone, but there was still a presence, something darker, something far more ancient and dangerous than anything we had encountered before. A low, menacing voice filled the air, though it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You have made your offering, but the house demands more." Before I could react, the ground beneath us trembled, and the walls began to warp again, twisting into unnatural shapes. The house wasn't done with us, it never would be. We had awakened something far more powerful than the spirits Jacob had warned us about. Lily grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to get out of here." But it was too late. The house had us in its grip, and I knew, in that moment, that there would be no escape. We had offered the locket, but the house demanded more. It demanded our very souls. 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 Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.